Of course. Here's what we have on our new website, everybody. Anybody want to repeat my words for me now? Audio podcasts, Astro Library, multimedia course, and certification. And here's a little more on that Astro Library. We have taken a dozen years of materials at the Evolutionary Astrology Network, all kinds of audio and video files, and we have put them into 3 different subject matters in which you can stream this information on a month basis, on a 6-month basis, on a 1-year subscription, and of course a monthly recurring subscription that you can cancel at any time once you have perused your way through all the material. And of course, here is our multimedia course that we've developed over the years. 250 hours of archived audio information from any course segment purchase that you can look at to your heart's content. The archived audio files can be downloaded onto your computer. They can be burned onto your little MP3 files like a iPhone or iPad or iPod. That was it, iPod. And you can listen to them while you walk the dog. That's been the joke for me. I walk a lot of dogs all over the world as people listen to these audio files. And of course, starting the beginning of 2014, I'm going to switch from teaching my monthly classes on segment 1, which I've done for 10 years. I'm going to switch now over to segment 2. And we're going to switch the monthly classes from being audio to being in a webinar format just like this. And we're going to start in and go through this subject of segment 2, relationship, sexuality, synastry, and composite charts from both a familial and an intimate perspective. And so what we are looking at today is most likely, basically, an initiation of this subject. And so at this point, I'd like to more formally welcome Mark Jones. Leroy, I'm ready for you to switch the screen over. Mark, hello again, and I would like you to give us a little background on yourself before your presentation, any opening screens you want to show. Let us know about you.
Okay, Kim. So my name's Mark, and I'm an evolutionary astrologer, but also a transpersonal psychotherapist. And I've been exploring, in a way, the interface of these two subjects. How does a karmic astrology and a spiritual psychology come together? What impact does it have on people's lives? And it's really a focus on astrology as a form of healing. In the first place, kind of an identification tool, if you like, a multi-dimensional map as to the kind of core issues or themes within the soul. But then more than that, you see, a map is not the territory, as we know. A menu, you can't eat the menu. It tells you you have a nice burger coming your way, but you can't taste that burger. And it's really the burger experience. Excuse me, vegetarians, it can be a veggie or a vegan burger, but the meat of a person's inner life is what concerns me more than the chart. So for me, it's always been about how to interface this incredible tool, this multidimensional map, with the actual soul energy of the individual. So I'm always trying to place the chart as a living bridge to the essence of the individual, not a screen. I mean, I've experienced people give talks about astrology or even giving readings. Sometimes physically the chart can be literally in between you as a piece of paper or a computer, almost as if the chart is like a defense against the individual. Here is this prescriptive map. I'm going to tell you about you. I'm going to tell you the nature of your personality. In fact, if I may, I'll just share a turning point in my life. I was a student of Noel Till's master's program in astrology, based on his magnum opus, Synthesis and Counseling in Astrology. And I was doing a reading for an older lady, maybe in her 70s, who was quite wise, quite psychologically minded. And half an hour in, I told her these things about her parental dynamics, about her psychology, and she was like, "Very good, young man. You're spot on." And never has a seeming compliment sounded so hollow to me. There was just a feeling in the air, in the field between us, of disappointment. It's like, yes, I'd done my thing that I'd trained for, I'd done it well, and all it had essentially done is told this lady what she already knew. So, you know, the reading could have ended there. But I was like, well, actually, I've been studying this other form of astrology, evolutionary astrology, and I haven't fully integrated this form yet. I've literally, this is simply 6 months maybe after my first exposure to it as a proper teaching. But I'm just beginning to think about it in my personal life, looking at charts of friends and people I know. I said, if you like, we have some time, can I look at the chart from that point of view? Maybe that will offer something different. And I began to go in with Pluto and the nodes on the level of why these dynamics had occurred in her life, why these parental situations, why this particular type of psychological makeup. And 5 or 10 minutes into the reading, the lady was in tears, tearing up with the sense of having been seen on a much deeper level. And it wasn't that I was telling her why exactly. We were just discussing the broader context of why these things might have occurred. And I found you can approach the context of deeper meaning without prescribing to people, without telling them who they are. And this was a very profound conflict for me, because the whole time I trained as a therapist, I had previously been an astrologer. And I had thought to myself, how do I deal with this seemingly unresolvable conflict between the therapeutic ideal, which is that the person self-discover, that they discover themselves true meaning in the process, and this sort of fantasy of an astrologer as a magician. Come to my parlor and I will tell you in 10 or 15 minutes who you are. And this seemed like an impossible conflict, that the two were moving in different directions. And what I've discovered is that they are not, that there is an actual alchemy that can take place where one is not telling people who or what they are or what they ought to do, but instead one is looking at the chart as a blueprint of the soul, if you like. And just like any good blueprint, you're looking for the actual building. If it was an architecture blueprint, you're looking for what building has been made or how the space will work. So I've taken to using the chart as a structural symbolic map for people's soul energy, so that even in a relatively short space of time, and let's face it, most readings are going to be a short space of time. And if you're a practicing astrologer listening to this, you'll recognize after a while, when you're doing a number of these, preparation time might not be that long realistically if you're going to do a number of these, and the amount of time you're going to have with people won't be that long. So I've been really focusing on how do you make this an effective medium to engage with people on a depth level in a relatively short space of time, using the fact that you have this soul map to supercharge the space with its architecture, if you like, its subtle architecture. To me, it's like an architecture of the unconscious, or what I call increasingly the non-linear energy field that people carry around them, their inner magnetism. And this leads us neatly, really, to the subject of today's talk, or workshop, and the side I'm going to input in this beginning section. So when we're talking about discovering and working with your essential needs, there's a number of key points emerging here. A, what is discovery? B, what is working with them? And what are needs? And what are essential needs as opposed to inessential needs? So there's a number of ways of looking, even at the title of this workshop, that raises interesting questions about what the astrological project is trying to do and how much healing and or transformation can be found in being an astrologer, and an astrologer who is, how to put this, sincerely dedicated to the higher good of the individual before you. That's the thing I always create as the foundation for my students and in my classes. I would rather someone have less technical know-how and more sincere intention for the higher good of the individual before them. I would much rather that situation than somebody full of technical information who is just simply, regurgitating that as a set pattern, regardless of the individual before them. So in a book that's just gone into the editing process at the moment called Therapeutic Astrology, I argue that the astrological reading is a de facto counseling dynamic, that there is no avoiding the fact that it is a relationship. You can try, you could do written readings, or even take them and post them to people. I mean, not an ideal form, in my view, as it completely breaks the dialogue with the real essential needs of the individual before you. But you could do that, and you still don't avoid the fact that it's a counseling dynamic. Because a person has come to you for help or assistance or with questions, they are a supplicant coming before you, and therefore they constellate energetic dynamics. They are invested in it. And in fact, you know, with regard to the subject I raised on Wednesday in the Radical Empowerment talk, as we see, like, astrology is, on the trash heap of history. Astrology, as Richard Tarner said, is the gold standard of superstition in the modern age. The value of astrology is denigrated by contemporary culture, extraordinarily so. It's vilified. It's literally like either you're just insane, nonsense, new age woo woo, or heretic, or devil worshipper. There's still some of that mentality around even. Yet the irony is, in a culture that has ejected meaning from the central dialogue of its philosophy and religion, astrology is one of the key conduits to soul in the modern era. And the other sort of fringe area of the depth psychology movement is spiritual psychology. And last year, a friend and I had the privilege to be in Florence in the personal archive of Roberto Assagioli, where we realized, this man who'd created the first explicitly spiritual depth psychology was also an astrologer and had box files labeled spiritual astrology. And all these detailed hand-drawn charts, handwritten notes, detailed elemental analysis of people's charts, meticulously and laboriously laid out. Must have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of study. In fact, Assagioli would not see clients in the second part of his life without their chart. So here is the, student of Freud, friend of Jung, who says, no, for the whole second half of his life, from his 40s to his 80s, I work with the chart and then with people. That's how much he sensed it could take you into a person's essence. Now, today we want to explore really a number of ways of approaching that essential self. The first is through Venus. And we're looking here at one of the many planets with a dual rulership. So Venus has an inner dimension in Taurus and an external dimension in Libra. Now, what does this mean? Now, remember, those of you who are here for the Radical Empowerment talk, and those who weren't, I'll catch us up. In a sense, the birth process at Aries, the pure instinctual body, the infant just touches, screams, cries, is pure, blind, instinctual energy, learning through doing, the perpetual freedom to learn how to be. Taurus is that phase in early childhood where meaning and value start to be internalized. What psychologists call self and object constancy. Being able to feel a solid sense of value in yourself. Now, what does this mean? And how can we use it astrologically? We're talking about the unconditioned needs of the self. How the self engages with the process of meeting its own biological survival needs and its emotional and psychological survival needs. If you wanted to, it's an entrance point into the chart. If you wanted to, you could just start with Venus, or the second house, or Taurus, and you would be opening a portal into how does this person relate to themselves on a deep level. Now, the external side of Venus in Libra is all to do with how this way of relating to yourself, Venus, gets pictured outwards to others. So it's two sides of the same coin. These appear like different processes. The relationships in your life appear as if they are different from how you relate to you. But the dual rulership of Venus would suggest that this is not the case, actually. That actually the relationships in your life are a direct mirror to how you relate to yourself. And how you relate to yourself is a direct mirror to the kinds of relationships you have. Think about that for a second. It's quite radical, really. Think about everyone you know in your life. Think about someone you love. Think about someone you really struggle with, or even hate, or feel frustrated by. Why are they ruining my life? All of those people speak to some aspect of the way you relate to self. Venus is just Venus. The seeming discrepancy between inner and outer, whilst it has a validity on one level, on another level it's the same core archetype. The inner relationship and the external relationships in your life come from the same place. One interesting phrase for that projection process is out-picturing. You have an inner picture, an inner ambience for the way you relate to yourself, and then as it were you shine the light of self through that picture out into the world, and other people, as it were, respond to that image that you shine outwards. And you invite them to come into your life and help you. You invite them to come into your life and abuse you. You invite them to come into your life and frustrate and restrict you. All based on the way the inner magnetism of the soul expresses through the Venus function. Now, we see here an image of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow was a kind of fourth wave psychologist, a humanistic psychologist who's beginning to have a kind of spiritual realization at the peak points of his work. In fact, he's renowned for coining the phrase peak experience, which he himself had, which altered the way he understood his work. And he sees this pyramid of needs arising. And what's interesting for us here, basic needs are like, food, sufficient warmth that you're not going to freeze to death. Safety needs are belonging, no one's threatening you, someone to hold. Social needs, so we see here at the bottom level, basic needs, Venus in Taurus. And we see that the shadow of the Venus, Taurus, and second house archetype is the threat to basic needs. When you see stress towards Venus, the second house ruler, planets in Taurus, you're looking at potential current life or prior life memories of a threat to those basic needs, a threat to survival, and the resulting survival anxiety. So we see basic needs, Venus and Taurus, emerging through safety needs in which Venus and the Taurus archetype blend with the Moon and Cancer, to social needs, Libra, 7th house, the outpicturing of those basic needs and how we then want and depend on others in our lives. Now what's interesting in Maslow's system for me is he then goes on to say esteem needs, which for many people is a word used in association with Venus, Taurus, and the second house, self-esteem. We actually see here what Maslow is suggesting and implying is this living dialogue between the two sides of Venus, that one's basic inner needs and one's social needs combine and blend to produce esteem. It's almost impossible to generate a lasting feeling of self-esteem, which is, crucial to many people and a crucial phase of inner development, when the people in your life are critical, abusive, unreliable, undermining you. It simply creates a negative feedback loop. And this, to me, is what Maslow is hinting at here. That esteem needs grow from a blend of social needs, Libra, safety needs, Moon, Cancer, basic needs, Venus, Taurus. It's a blending of these processes. So the two sides of Venus are actually in a completely dynamic relationship the whole time. They are inseparable. You cannot separate yourself from the people in your life and just say, I am me, and that's that. Or you can, but it's inherently restrictive. And what that does, and people do this, is it promotes a kind of blinkered reality based on survival anxiety and perceived threat from others. So another feature we see when we analyze the Venus function is when we see the second house under stress, planets in Taurus, Venus, we can see areas in life where the person has reduced their expectancies, reduced their interaction with others in order to minimize those anxieties, in order to minimize the threat to their basic needs. So basic needs take priority, and this is the point of Maslow's hierarchy. When your basic needs are under threat, the other needs cannot be focused on. You cannot focus on esteem needs. You cannot focus on self-actualization when you're under survival threat. And in fact, this is something I would argue in a reading situation, and has happened to me only a couple of times, but a few times I've been, I always start my readings by asking, how can I help today? Because I'm relating to the essential needs in the moment of the individual. How can I help you today? Let's just go straight into your real needs, if we can. And I remember, and I do a lot of work with trauma, and I'm, renowned for doing a certain amount of teaching work around the Uranus archetype and trauma. And someone asking about those signatures in their chart in terms of past life significance. And then my discovery that these traumatic signatures were completely playing out actively in the individual's life right here, right now. Someone was still entering this person's home and safe space and beating them within an inch of their life. And at that point, I changed the context of the reading as to what is happening right now. So even I would argue this model is quite interesting, even in the way we approach astrological counseling, if you like. How we approach the multidimensional map of the chart, which will change. It will actually change based on the different time periods the person is in their life. It's almost as if soul only allows what is possible at the time. And you realize you're not just reading a chart sometimes. You're reading the amount of the nonlinear field allowed in the present moment to come through. Now, I'll go on to talk about that a bit later, but here, when we see basic needs and safety needs under threat, the whole hierarchy of needs are under threat. It's almost irrelevant to discuss someone's, esteem potential, their validation, or their potential for self-actualization whilst they're still in a traumatizing and abusive situation. Seemingly obvious, perhaps, to a counselor or a therapist, but actually not an issue that's raised perhaps enough in the astrology community. Now, here we have a visual of the two sides of Venus in the archetypal zodiac with Aries on the ascendant. And we see there is an inconjunct aspect between them. the inconjunct as an aspect is somewhat akin to Virgo, because Virgo is the sign that makes this aspect to Aries the ascendant in the archetypal or natural zodiac. So, what is the Virgo nature of this aspect between the two sides of Venus? Well, Virgo is a transitional archetype. From the full creative self-expression of Leo, Virgo turns that on its head into an internal self-analysis, an inner Mercury, a yin Mercury sign. And it's as if the fullness of the song of yourself, the ideal of Leo is to sing the song of yourself, to be as joyous and beautiful and creative as you can really be. And then Virgo is the crisis that then befalls that self singing its glorious song as part of a necessary evolution towards Libra, towards the recognition that others are equal, that the song of yourself has to blend equally with the song of other people. Now, this is not an easy transition at all. There's an inherent crisis in the Virgo archetype because it is hard to pause or stop the song of yourself. It can feel as if someone ripped the sun out of you, the heart out of you. The solar self feels like our heart. It's the beating heart of the hero or heroine's journey, if you like. It doesn't feel good when someone rips the living heart out of you. And this is the power that relationships have, is it not? People kill themselves. Negative expression of Taurus as relating to biological survival. They fail their basic needs to survive because the love of another has departed. In worst case scenarios, men kidnap the children, kill children, and then kill themselves to just, paint the glorious screw you in ever more vibrant colors. This is how hurt people feel. They feel as if the heart of themselves has been ripped out by another. This is what you do when you give another person that power in a way, when you invest in them the projection of your real basic needs, of your Taurus inner value, unconditioned self. So there's an inherent crisis that occurs in relationships. And I would observe as a therapist now for 12 or 13 years, after thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of clients, how all relationship crises, all without exception, involve a significant wound, paradox, or core challenge in the person's relationship to themselves. They're almost always a manifestation of an inner split or ambivalence or area that the person has tried to cover up or hide away from themselves or deceive themselves. Other people bring us ourselves. It's the great challenge in recovering addicts in the 12-step program. Many recovering addicts stay off drink or stay off drugs, but they never form relationships again because it's the one great trigger point. It's the one thing, if you invest yourself in that level intimately, if you give of yourself the projection of your value to another, the threat it places on self if that other apparently drops the ball, apparently acts or behaves in such a way as to spill your living heart onto the muddy streets and trample on it. So some of the inherent crisis, the almost obsessional interest in relationships, in human life, from popular magazines to dramas and soap operas, obsessed about relationships. And in a sense, because we're obsessed about ourselves, we're obsessed about our relationship with ourselves and how we give of that to others and what sort of meaning and value we project onto others as a result. So we see in Maslow's hierarchy of needs the way that basic needs and social needs ideally blend towards esteem, validation of self, which becomes the basis for self-actualization, true creative self-transformation, or what you might call individuation in a Jungian sense. Yet, how if social needs break down or the Libra projection breaks down, people can go into a radical lack of safety or even risk or fail to take care of their basic needs. And these may not always be current life traumas. You can see in past life trauma signatures in people's charts frequently times when a relationship betrayal has led to some kind of sense of just giving up, or a very traumatic, social situation, say being torn apart, torn away from loved ones by war or famine or slavery, and how people then just give up on self. This is something that Viktor Frankl explored, the man who founded a form of therapy called logotherapy, who himself was interred in Auschwitz, um, didn't realize that his mother and father and wife were all killed in different camps the very day that he was taken in. He began to observe when people lost something that was truly precious to them, whether it be a connection with a loved one, or for one lady, it was they shaved her hair, her beautiful long golden tresses of hair, that they would collapse, and then within days they would die in that situation. And he faced that precipice moment when his own self-actualization was challenged, when they found his copy of his thesis, the only copy he had, handwritten thesis, sewn into his jacket, and destroyed it in front of him. And he teetered on the edge, but was strong enough to kind of um, see through the identification, if you like. And he developed through a really rather wonderful book dictated in the 6 weeks, 2 months after he left Auschwitz, called Man's Search for Meaning. He showed how meaning is fundamental to survival. So actually, esteem needs and self-actualization could almost be reversed to at another level and go back to basic needs. What people invest their hope in, what they invest their meaning in, becomes essential to them, and then essential to their survival. Frequently, this is an investment in other people. The Taurus side of Venus investing in the Libra side of Venus. Now, what I want to talk about at this point is a kind of childhood crisis that I think many, if not all of us, go through in some way. A crisis that you could argue is the central and only theme, say, of Catcher in the Rye. Why did this book by Salinger, this tale of this precocious, awkward mess of a teenager, capture so many people's imagination, as he, saw the world around him as full of phonies, and preserves this sentimental image of being this catcher in a field of rye where the children play next to an enormous cliff, and when they fall off the cliff he catches them and puts them back. He's trying to preserve an innocence, a romantic idyll, something like the romantic poets were trying to capture through the magic of childhood. We come trailing clouds of glory, said Wordsworth. Now, this is from the point of view of the work of A.H. Almass, who is revisioning psychology essentially from a pure spiritual lens. We are born with an essential self, with something beautiful, with a spark of soul or divinity. And actually, this is quite a radical viewpoint in today's age, as we'll go on to explore perhaps throughout this presentation. We can see this runs counter to the predominant view of this time. Not being seen for what we truly are has led to the betrayal of this preciousness that is our essential core. People in our early environment not only did not see and support our true self, but wanted us to be something else, conditioned us to fit their idea of what we are or what we should be. And this leads to this sense of betrayal. And we know we're sensitive to this sense of betrayal whenever we feel a hurt about not being seen or not being recognized for who we are now. We know that's sending us back to this kind of hurt. Now, Almass goes deeper. I mean, this is in a sense a common understanding that present day hurts send us back into the core childhood hurt and disappointment that our parents or our teachers don't recognize who we really are. He goes deeper. He recognizes that we don't just feel betrayal about them. It's not just a Libra projected sense of blame or betrayal. We feel betrayed because we know we sold something out inside. We know that we couldn't, in a way, bear the isolation of staying with who we really were. To be real meant being isolated from the environment. We could not tolerate such isolation and abandonment. So we pretend to be like them. Their world, the world of lies, the world of the shell, the conventional world. This is the betrayal within. Another layer. So the Libra insight collapses into a Taurus basic essential relationship to self inside. And then he expands the point even more profoundly in a way. Because, excuse me, um, whilst this process would apply to people in dysfunctional families, he is saying, in a way, because this is about the divine spark within the soul, the pearl of great price, your innermost essence, that even the most loving family, even the most incredibly supportive parents, do not always get the quality of your inner jewel, your pearl of great price. They are not capable of seeing your essence at all points. So we begin to recognize that what is being understood least about us in some ways is our most precious core. And so we either give up on that precious core or we hide it away, like those fairy tales, this thing of great price hidden, up the stairs, up the mountain. Great sacrifices have to be made. You find the hidden room in the back, guarded by the strange monsters. We put it far away. We hide our essential self because we cannot understand why it's not being applauded or reflected back at us. And I believe this is a kind of, central human ordinary tragedy of human meaning. This is, if you like, the fall from Eden on a psychological level and on a spiritual level coming into this life as soul manifesting through this tiny growing being. Um, can you guys hear me okay? I'm just getting a little red warning sign about.
We can hear you just fine, Mark.
Brilliant.
It'll probably pop in and out.
So, we see that the common understanding of narcissism is this kind of, in love with your reflection in the mirror. Whereas actually, the great narcissistic hurt we all face is the feeling, what happens to our most precious self? How is our most precious self received by the world? And if we have prolonged memories of it not being received, what we have done with that? Have we abandoned that self altogether? Have we hidden it in fantasy and imagination? Compensatory dreams where we're special. You see that, you know, superhero comics and stuff appeal to this sensibility of the teenage self, feeling abandoned, but actually secretly I have special powers and I can show my true magical self and achieve something in the world. We see that the narcissistic wound in a more general sense is something we all face as human beings, and it's actually part of the crisis between the Taurus and Libra dual sides of Venus. Now, what is most common is that people create a false or adaptive self in Libra, 7th house descendant. They create a sort of workable self to deal with other people, to deal with school, to deal with things when you don't feel like it, to a face you put on to your mum and dad no matter what's going on inside you. The problem is the perennial problem. The wind seems to change and, the role sticks. Something you did for a few months, a few years as a teenager or as a small child in order just to adapt to school or a certain teacher or, your father shouting at you suddenly becomes the dominant way you approach the world, and you've forgotten that it was even a temporary disguise. You've actually forgotten that you chose to put on that routine, as it were, in order to get by. So this false or adaptive self isn't bad. In fact, it may be incredibly useful in certain dysfunctional family situations, the false self is absolutely essential. Otherwise, people wouldn't survive. They wouldn't be able to bear the degree of neglect or abuse, the you know criticism or persecution that they receive. In dysfunctional families, there's no investment for standing out. In a loving family, child comes and sings their song from school that day and everyone applauds and they're glad to be center stage. In a dysfunctional family, you don't want to be center stage. Anything could happen to you. So the false self has this sometimes very profound survival reason, Taurus. Taurus applying to Libra. We put on the face in order to survive. And these childhood experiences may correspond to profound past life memories. For example, if you're captured and taken away from your loved ones and you grow up as a slave, you don't have any real freedom. You have to put on a face. Libra, 7th house. You have to put on a mask for the one side of Venus to cover over the hole where your freedom or potential used to be. These can echo through childhood. Why is one child so sensitive to changing school or losing a friend, whereas another child seems fine about it? All depends on the association of karmic memories with these events, where the person is going to be prone, where these childhood significant occurrences echo karmic experience. And that's what I found more and more as a psychotherapist working with evolutionary astrology. Early childhood significant experiences and stages of growth mirror and echo certain specific significant prior life memories. And often the trauma from the prior life reverberates through the childhood trauma in the current life. Now, this is a seemingly could be seen as abstract kind of point, this one, from Almas, from one of his first really important works. What's he saying here? He's saying that this thing we're talking about, essence, the innermost self, the true self, the pearl beyond price, the diamond within, the jewel inside your heart, the flame within you, is not a metaphor. These are not poetic terms. They are a literal truth. There is a literal soul essence within you. It's not a metaphor for something else. It's not an image of something. And he goes on, for the individual who recognizes essence as a substance with physical characteristics, self-realization will happen naturally. You have a living essence inside you. That's where your essential needs arise from, because that is your essential self that is expressing those needs. That's the real radical application of a core spiritual foundation to any form of psychological work. You really have a pearl inside you. You have a luminescence. You have a glowing beauty that is real, that is energetically real. Soul is energetically real. It is not an abstract thing. It is not a metaphorical thing. We're not talking about things that just refer in a vague, like a poem, alluding to something kind of way. Soul is literal. It is literally the foundation of your manifestation, body, emotion, mind. And Almas's point is so interesting, especially for those of us who are interested in evolutionary astrology because of its spiritual philosophy, essentially. Because when essence is recognized, it starts to live and function. When you start to recognize soul, it starts to recognize you. You feel you're like a fisherman in the river of life, or on a pathway, a great journey to find your soul. And suddenly one day you catch yourself looking up, looking back, and you realize soul has been searching you. It is alive. The light in you is alive, and as you begin to pay attention to it, it begins to turn up. And as that light turns up, ever increasing awareness grows with it. I would argue there's a very specific type of essence quality that arises when you accept evolutionary astrology on a certain level or work with these symbols archetypally in their multidimensional format. In recognizing, say, that Venus and Taurus in the second house have something to do with, feeling safe as a very small child, but also the echoes in that of past life traumas to your physical or biological safety. When you start to see the archetypes in this flexible, multidimensional way, an aspect of essence, a sort of sparkling quality of mind and heart starts to open around astrology itself. It can literally become a spiritual tool. It starts to awaken something in your own intuition. And then your own intuition is leading you further into what awakened you. So, astrology of a certain kind or an understanding of the archetypes awakens that intuition. And then as that intuition progresses, it awakens more of the astrology and the archetypes. And then, boom, they feed back to that intuition. It just grows, snowballs. Now, what's radical here in some ways, especially within the origins of psychoanalysis and even the great majority of psychology in the world today, cognitive approaches, psychiatry, behaviorism, to even posit a false self, which was the brave step of Donald Winnicott, the child psychiatrist who did brilliant work with many, many young children, play work, helping them integrate family troubles. He was an honest enough psychoanalyst to recognize there was something real in the being of these children. They were not just an accumulation of drives and mechanisms like Freud saw. So just to state there is a real self is a radical step in this world. Just to recognize in yourself, or when you do a reading, even look at just family or friends' charts, to even just simply recognize right from the beginning, there is a real self. They have a real self. That soul is real, not a metaphor, a living, energetic truth, vibrating, shining, right now, undimmed, undimmable, cannot ever really be hurt, that quality. It's inviolate. It's, you know, like an immortal diamond. It can't ever be scratched. To even recognize that is an incredibly intense step and service towards the other person. And I feel I can say this to you after having tested it many, many, many hundreds of times now. If you hold this attitude in an astrology reading, it will change your astrology readings. Regardless of your level of understanding of astrology, or the archetypes, or aspects, or phases, it will simply change the way you do astrology, just to hold that insight. Just that radical, simple thing in and of itself. Now, this real or true self in some ways transcends the chart, or is a complete, you know, the living energetic blueprint of the person's soul as mapped by the whole chart, the map not being the actual soul. But to understand the unconditioned needs of the self, what we're saying when we talk about Venus, Taurus in the second house as the unconditioned self or the real essential needs of the person, we're talking about on the truest level the expression of that essence as it applies to the personal self and how the person takes care of themselves, how they relate to themselves, how they hold themselves, touch themselves. So if you want to go in to someone's chart on that level, you could just start with the second house cusp. You could go to the ruler. You could go to the Venus placement, planets in Taurus, even signs that are in the second house. Planets, in the second house that are not in the sign that was on the cusp. And you will begin to gain detailed information about the way people hold and value themselves and the basis of how they begin to read their real needs. And I'm just going to look at a quick example of that. Well, in fact, before we do, I'll just check in. Are there any questions or anything that remains unclear for anyone of what I've shared already?
No questions coming in. There are some requests for maybe PDF of your slideshow presentation, Mark, but we'll deal with that a little later.
Great.
Thank you very much. Very engaging information, and I'm sure everybody's looking at their second house cusp as you proceed. But feel free to raise your hand out there, everybody. If Mark's inviting some questions, so raise your hand to respond.
Great. Um, so here we have a chart, and we see Leo on the second house cusp. So straight away we're into this sense of that song of the solar self, you know? I wish to sing myself my own true song, my creative actualization, my self in its glory. And then we see the ruler of the second house cusp, the sun, is in Virgo in the third house. So we see that this song of myself is being ruled by the sun in Virgo in that crisis tipping point. The archetype past Leo, fifth house, sun, Virgo, sixth house equivalent, inner Mercury, the inner self-analysis, the inner criticism, the inner um, turning on its head of the glory of the self in order to begin to approach relationships as an equal. And then we see inside the second house, Mars in Virgo. And then Mars is in Virgo, conjunct the South Node in Virgo. So straight away, just from that analysis, we see that there is a core contrast between the essential needs of the self, Leo, to sing the song of the self, and yet everything else is weighed towards this Virgo crisis around that. There's multiple signatures of a crisis around meeting those essential needs. The sun is in Virgo in the third. The person is thinking a lot about who they really are, maybe quite insecure about that, maybe very sensitive to the verbal criticism of others. When you blend Gemini and Virgo, for me, Gemini third house is about communication, but Virgo, the positive ideal would be discriminating communication, but when it's in crisis, it would tend to be receiving persecutory or negative communication from others. And then we see Mars with the South Node in Virgo in the second house, and we realize Mars in Virgo, especially essentially in conflict like this, conjunct the South Node, or bringing something in from the past, is an unresolved crisis about the way this person feels about themselves on really quite a primary level, second house, on an essential level. And we see that, as well as at the active aspect of the desire nature, Mars, the instinctual will, as it operates in a yang, outgoing fashion, is also involved in this. And there may be a crisis or confusion about sexuality, about anger issues, profound crisis in the self about, how they feel about themselves, with perhaps this particular sensitivity to the criticism of others. And then we see that the Mars South Node are square the Moon in Sagittarius in the fifth house. And this repeats this overlay of the Leo signature on the second house cusp, Moon in the fifth, but square the nodal axis, square the Mars. So this desire again to sing the song of myself, to flower like Whitman and be joyous and creative, is under conflict, under stress, square to the nodal axis, and actually also conjunct Neptune in Scorpio, late Scorpio, which is also square the nodal axis. So here we see, just in the symbolism of following the second house out through implications, through, the cusp, the ruler of the cusp, planets within the house, and then significant aspects they're making. We already have this picture of this person who really deep down, wants to be loved, wants to get out, wants to sing their song and be applauded, and who's in crisis about it. And where is this crisis coming from? Well, Moon square the nodes, Moon square Mars, something in the family perhaps, something in the early development of the self where some kind of critical message or perceived lack has engendered this crisis in self. This is all just from relatively simple step-by-step following of the second house Taurus Venus symbolism. And then we go to Venus, and it's in Scorpio in the fourth house. And once again, this suggestion that something in the family has occurred that has made a deep impact on this person. And that Venus is conjunct Jupiter, which, although they're traditionally seen as benefics, in some senses a conjunction is a stressful aspect. There is some sense to which there may be a sensitivity to a feeling of betrayal in the family, which also allies the Neptune in late Scorpio with the moon, square the nodal axis. This feeling of being used by others or betrayed, or an idealism about the family being betrayed, and feeling, terrible inside as a result. This Virgo crisis running through the second and into the third, especially with this sensitivity, I would suggest, to what others say. Sun in Virgo in the third, ruling the second house cusp. What others say to this person, criticism if you like, goes in deeply. Leo, second house cusp, Sun ruler. It goes. They take it to heart. I mean, okay, I moved quickly. I'm used to looking at charts and moving, and I know this chart. But I think we could all agree, if we just pause and follow those steps in your mind, and they're written in the text box on the side, some of them, we can agree, we've just gone in really through the second house. We haven't tried to contextualize the whole chart. We've not allowed ourselves to become overwhelmed. That the most common reason why people struggle when they read charts, try and take on too much of the information too quickly. We've just gone in through the doorway of the second house and the essential self and the way the person relates to their essential needs. And a picture is emerging, I think. And of course, I can corroborate that picture. This is a young man who, loves his family, is quite outgoing on one level, and as from a relatively young age, pre-puberty, as he, progressively realizes he's homosexual, and this, because he's outgoing, because he's sort of larger than life and expressive, this emerges in the family environment, receives a sort of fundamentalist Christian critique from, in particular, his grandparents, culminating with his grandfather as a large family gathering, proclaiming him as evil for being homosexual. And he's, not yet sort of 12 years old or something. And we can see, can't we, from the chart, that this goes in very deeply. This goes right into the heart of him, like a weird, multi-bladed knife. You can see that just from analysis of the second house cusp and following planets in there, rulers, significant, fourth harmonic aspects being made to planets in the house, can take us right into the core crisis that we can see on another level with Mars conjunct the South Node in Virgo. This is being brought in as an unresolved anger, frustration, and crisis from a past life, where there would have been, obviously, some kind of heavy Christian conditioning. But it's so interesting to me that you can go so deeply into what impacted this person just through that analysis. And in fact, it really encapsulates the pathology that later on this young man, expressed his creativity through, which was a bipolar condition in which he was primarily unipolar. So bipolar is normally a swinging between very severe depression and elevated states of mania and excitement, and spending all your money in inappropriate sexual behavior and having so much fun you don't know, where you are 3 days later, or what happened to your wallet and where you were sleeping or anything. He would tend towards that side. It would kind of offset the inner shame, so that he wouldn't have to fall into the severe depression, and he would act the Leo second house cusp, the solar aspect of it, the moon in the fifth with Neptune, in an unboundaried way. He would express this manic celebration of life, all the time splitting from the part of him that felt that that it had cut into the heart of this, you're evil, publicly in a family situation, and no one in the family protected him. No one turned around and said, no, you're not, So it's really quite interesting to me, and I hope I'm making this point clearly in a technical sense, just
Mark,
how deep. Yeah, go on. You can go into a chart. Yeah,
you
go on.
are making it
Yes,
very, very deep, for
Mhm.
just, not to confuse any or move too fast or go
yes,
too far ahead here. But there was a question from the board, suggesting that maybe this split personality that you just described, if I'm getting that right,
yes,
could that be
yes,
indicated by that Saturn in the Taurus, sign of
yes.
Taurus, 11th house?
Which
Exactly.
part
It's
of the
very good.
complex?
Yes, very good. Very good. And look at how it opposes Neptune. And Saturn's in the 11th house, so for me it takes on something of the Aquarian archetype, which I'm arguing has this aspect to, in the radical empowerment talk, I was arguing has this aspect to the non-linear memory of the soul, holding imprints. And here we see, yes, some restrictive authority on that core survival level. And I believe this would correspond to a past life trauma signature, the Saturn opposite Neptune. And it would, because of the physical nature of Saturn traumas and in Taurus, have involved a biological threat in the past. So this would constellate a memory in which this person was probably killed for some kind of religious persecution story or mentality, and it's what then comes together in the family. But yes,
And
the father doesn't
religious,
support him. Yeah, and the grandfather acts as this super Saturn figure. Yep.
yeah,
Okay.
and I would see the religious persecutions around sexuality in the soul
Yes.
both tie in, and probably
Yes.
from those family of origins.
Yes. Well, yes, you wonder what's gone on, even in earlier parts of the current life family, for a grandfather to be so
Mm-hmm.
absurdly convinced of the, validity of saying that. You wonder what personal sort of abusive scenarios have occurred, or fantasy material has occurred in the grandfather's past, or in, earlier generations of the family system.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Thank you.
so
Excellent, Mark.
yes, yeah. I'll just say this insight of Jung's, in a way that is so crucial. When you yourself can't own who you are, then the world around you must act it out for you. It's almost like soul is such a powerful living substance that if you cut off from huge parts of its flow, the flow of life around you will express it instead. Yeah. Um, should we take a short pause, or?
That might be good. We've went a full hour, so
Sure. Yeah. Why don't
good.
you take a little break and get your water, whatever, and
Yes.
I'll launch our first poll. Kind of a simple observational poll while Mark takes his break. And
Great stuff. I'll see you guys in a minute.
sure. Thank you, Mark. And so, have you indeed observed this Venus-Saturn conjunction? We've created this conference, this webinar, based upon this transit, and I'm just curious if any of you have been blessed to observe this in the evening sky, if possible. About half the people are chiming in here and voting. So Kim and I were just out on the cliff last night, and quite impressive that we got to, after I completed some things downstairs in the studio, she came to get me just in time to see Venus about 10-15 minutes from setting, and just as a mirror behind Venus in the evening sky, you can see the lined up glowing image of Saturn as well. So it was just I guess, a real powerful opportunity to bring these archetypes alive in a visual way, a real way. Okay, most everybody's voted, so we'll close the poll and just kind of see what some of the results were here. All right, everybody's going to be checking it out tonight. Everybody's going to be taking a look. Hopefully, wherever you're at in the world, you can take advantage of looking in the evening sky and perceiving Venus-Saturn conjunction.
And Leroy, the Venus-Saturn conjunction is not like, those of us who watch the Venus-Moon conjunctions. Whenever Venus is a morning star and evening star once a month, it makes those conjunctions to the moon. It usually is 7 times on each side. Once in a while, there's an 8th. And so a lot of those fairy tales get written about those Venus Moon conjunctions, shedding her veils and then picking herself up and picking up her veils again. The difference with the Venus Saturn is that they're going to be this close together for basically a good few weeks to maybe almost a month. So you can see Saturn will eventually get too close to the horizon to be able to see it visually, and you've got to look for it almost before it's dark, right when it's getting to dusk and turning to dark. So if you live in a big city, go see if you can find a high point and really take a look at it because it's beautiful to watch right now.
Oh, yeah, certainly was for us, and something that we wanted to share with this poll. So as we kind of wait for Mark to return, Kim, is there anything that you needed to announce, wanted to announce at the end of the first 70 minutes or so of
No, no, I'm just perfectly content here to listen to Mark weave this story for us, and then we'll both work with some other chart example later on.
yeah, the simplicity of that second house cusp in action as you just kind of look at the power of what's being put forth here is just you can do an entire reading almost by focusing on
Mm-hmm.
these Taurus archetypes, second house, planets in the second. Um, I'm sure
And
everybody's got
that's
their
so
charts out.
that's so much the depth of evolutionary astrology. You can take just a single archetype or a single concept and just layer after layer after layer. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of getting in touch with my emotional body here with Cancer on the second, ruler moon in Scorpio.
No, Leroy, you're one of those who has Leo in the second house cusp as well. As we're waiting for Mark, I'll take another opportunity to just say thank you to all of you who have shown up this week. It's been an initiation for Leroy and I, and yet it's been real sweet to see how well this webinar medium, which I think is just going to explode in many areas of life, but especially astrology, how beautiful it is for us to take these visual examples and understand and learn astrology in just deeper and deeper levels because we can do it visually as well as audibly now.
Yeah, and we just had a comment from Sean in Canada about the power of the format because, of course, Mark is a very powerful speaker. He's got a unique style. It's clear. It's psychological. It's deep, but it's soft. And
I
so
unmuted you, Mark.
Sean was going on
Thanks,
to
Kim.
just say that how one can become so deeply triggered just by listening to some of this information, Mark. So I guess that's the best compliment I can pass along to you as a speaker.
Well, thanks for the feedback, Sean. And even as I'm speaking about this stuff, one goes through something, especially that sense of the pearl, the essence of yourself, and how in childhood these crises arise where, the imperfect understanding of your parents, you know, doing their best but partial, imperfect, loving but dysfunctional, whatever, and how that primacy of that subtle grief hurt, even as a very young boy that I'm aware of. The recognition that you carrying something as a small child is sort of magic, is sort of pure possibility, and those moments where it just seems to kind of fall out of your grasp, spill to the floor, be unnoticed. Yeah, that to me was a. I thought, I would really recommend the work of this Almas generally, but for those who are counselors and psychotherapists, I would recommend his Diamond Mind series that I took that from. But for those who aren't counselors and psychotherapists, I would really recommend his Diamond Heart series, These are much more personal oral talks, and they're not using the specialized therapeutic language, which, frankly can be a hindrance to enjoying a good read.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have a little bit more. I go into Neptune a little bit if we need it down the line, or if we take a different turn at
Just
this point.
you're doing beautiful. Just carry on, honey.
All right, great stuff. Um, so this core Jungian insight, in a way, that you it's this perceived split between self and world that actually isn't really there because of living soul, because of who you really are. Reality itself dances to your tune. And if you are unconscious of who you really are, that doesn't stop the creative power of the soul. It's just the creative power of the soul will just manifest in a different way. So people manifest their creativity through victim situations that dramatize their own hurt. They um, create situations that, in the case of that young man, that appear to just be terrible, traumatic situations. But when we realize, as Kim was pointing out, the clear past life memories, the signatures of actual religious persecution in past lives, we see that he's recreating something intentionally, an intentional crisis in a sense. Mars in Virgo on the south node in the second house, the will is intentionally bringing in something from the past that was too freaked out by all of this, and he's had the opportunity in constellating a soul drama for his family to express that. And actually, that's really what I wanted to look at a second. I'll come back to these points, but just to go to this chart, you can look at, of course, the second house, Taurus, as we were looking here. But of course, opposite to Taurus is Scorpio in the eighth house. In here, soul, as it were, the deep self, psychological, emotional core of the self, Scorpio, challenges the way we've met our needs in the past, the way the essential self tends to stay fixated on those basic needs, that lowest level of the Maslow hierarchy, and stays in a blinkered kind of world in order to stay safe. And the eighth house, Scorpio, Pluto, represent, events and people and inner experiences that we magnetize towards us through the power of our own soul to challenge us beyond the second house, beyond our kind of ways and strategies we have of managing ourselves. This is the death of the maiden. This is the rape of Persephone by Pluto, the daughter of a corn goddess, in the field, Venus in her innocence, representing the psyche in its innocence. And then, whoom, the ground is ripped asunder. Pluto comes up in his chariot and takes her down to the underworld. That thing happens. Your grandfather calls you evil because you're a young homosexual, or someone you love dies, or your first sexual initiation and then the complex feelings afterwards, or someone attacks you at school and you've never known violence before that. Whatever it is, these initiatory experiences where the naive part of psyche is suddenly grasped and taken as the underworld. And of course, Pluto, Scorpio, 8th house, is the other real entry point into the chart, the one I would use the more often. And yet, how powerful is the second house, Taurus, Venus? As Leroy was saying, only half joking, you could do a whole reading from that point of view. I remember one time a week in one of the full week schools I did in London in 2003, we spent a whole day just reading charts from second house and those steps we just followed. That's the only way we'd start charts. It's incredible how far you end up getting to Pluto, which is the place I would normally start. So just to return to that chart, normally I would look at Pluto in Virgo in the 4th house, and I would see a crisis in the family being manifested on a soul level, probably through one or both of the parents fundamentally failing to understand the child or criticizing them. or persecuting them even, Virgo, and that this, has gone on for a long time because Pluto is conjunct Mercury. It's reached a peak of intensity, and Mercury is retrograde, and Mercury rules the south node. So it's like a kind of weight in the chart on the points to do with the past. If we follow Pluto, south node ruler, they're all in Virgo, and the south node ruler is retrograde, and Mars is on the south node, and Sun's in Virgo too. It's just this huge Virgo crisis going on through the family, and to me it's all a trauma signature because the Pluto is widely conjunct the Uranus. The essence of the core psychological experience is traumatic through others in Libra in the fourth, family members. And of course, as Kim pointed out, this will have happened before in past lives with family members. But the Pluto level is this why. What's challenging the second house, the stuckness, the blinkeredness for survival reasons? And here we clearly see the intention to develop security from within, to become self-empowered, to experience profound rejection, to trigger the past life memories and frustrations, and to begin to North Node Pisces heal them through some kind of deeper commitment to self, North Node in the 8th, and Pluto in the 4th, emotionally finding in the emotional body depth of connection to soul. Obviously, his particular pathology shows the struggle with that, how the ego is almost caved in under the pressure. The one beautiful thing in working together was, and this is an interesting point about how the second house links to the 7th house here, because the projection became as he left his family and tried to explore his sexuality and just sort of escape these messages, and he got into smoking a lot of dope, and he was actually hanging out with this much older man, Capricorn on the 7th, who would burden him. He was a disabled, quite bitter older man, and he was, acting as a real kind of dangerous authority figure for this young man. And this sort of angry, embittered, disabled man in a wheelchair was sort of practicing magic and had managed to, in this kind of drugged haze, add to this young man's sense of being evil, because he believed that this older man had summoned some kind of entity to possess him, or he was very, very frightened. Now, when I was a young man, I'd studied quite a lot of like Kabbalistic white magic. I knew quite a lot about magic. I knew quite a lot about some of the things that this man had been, messing around with, and they weren't, really very powerful things. I mean, it was more just a fantasy in this young man's head, already so prone to this idea of evil. And the one thing we were able to do over time was separate this idea that he was demonic, which of course was very liberating for him. He went into a fantastically good Leo, second house cusp, Sun, Moon in the 5th, great mood, and stopped therapeutic contact and went manic essentially, but at least free from the idea that he'd been tainted by this, dubious, rather pathetic magician. So to me, you can start with the Pluto level, Scorpio 8th, and go into the chart at depth on the level of why. But you can start with Taurus, the second house, and get to the level of what it's really like for them, how they relate to themselves on a core level, and actually imaginatively being able to hold both approaches that sort of meet in the middle gives one both the kind of depth soul perspective and this kind of relational, empathetic, way of going into what their experience is on a more intimate level. And whilst we talk about that experience, I've really found this strange little book by a Jewish theologian called Martin Buber to be extraordinarily profound. I mean, I've read it twice and I still don't understand it. And I don't, Martin Buber was asked to clarify its extremely poetic writing and never really did. But everyone who reads it gets a sense, even as they don't understand it, of this profound point about I and thou, which is the name of the book, and the point he makes that there are two basic ways of relating in this sacred universe. There is the I to a thou, the sacred indwelling soul, the living light in the other person, or there is an I-it relationship, where the other person is just an object or a tool for you to manipulate, to get what you want. And, if I was to go back to a critique of some of this projected crisis, I would say, out of survival anxiety, Taurus, people use other people, Libra, the other side of Venus, to try and fulfill what's missing in their Taurus second house Venus experience. They try and get seventh house Venus to fill in for the absences in second house Venus. And this is fundamentally a disaster in many ways. And this is fundamentally, unless it's held by a larger field of energy, not love, but actually just making relationship on the basis of projected needs or expectations, or really selfish fulfillment. Now, what is? I'll say one point about this meaning that I was talking about at the beginning. We expelled God as a tyrant because God was becoming a tyrant in the way that God was being visioned by the church, placing blocks on science, ridiculous narrow-minded views of human behavior. And of course we see with the example of this young man, better have no God than a tyrannical one that tells you you're evil just because, you like guys, and you are a guy, really. Excuse my crassness here, but is dick so offensive to the world that this vast creator of everything would care if you like dick or something else? What? It's just literally madness, isn't it? But the problem here is that in rejecting this terrible tyrannical father, we have erected a false idol in a certain form of science, or what I would call scientism, which is this primitive existential philosophy that goes hand in hand with science. We're just racing along on a, floating rock in space and no one cares. So it's like we've gone from this over-invasive, abusive parent, tyrant God, who cares about what you get up to in your sex life, all the way to there's no one at all. It's just obvious two extremes. We've gone from the abusive, dysfunctional father to no father, or no other. Now, this is part of my point about what astrology is capable of, in a way, returning to cosmos. This sense of higher meaning, because the final step one can take in this process is relating Venus and its dual rulership to its higher octave Neptune, which holds and contains Venus, really. There's all sorts of problems with this, but in an ideal world, Neptune represents the transpersonal love that holds the individual meeting of needs and the projected needs. So held in love, the fact that you have needs, Taurus second house, and that you have needs of the other, Libra seventh house, is something that is a meaningful dance, a harmonious dialogue, because it's held by love. In a world where you're just an isolated little unit hurtling on a rock through space at 10,000 miles an hour, that dialogue is not harmonious. That is not a dance held in love. It is more an aggressive seeking for unmet needs, which basically destroy people's lives, destroy people's marriages. So we see, again, this inconjunct, this Virgo type aspect, if you like, this crisis type aspect between Pisces and Libra. And this can show, in a way, this crisis that goes on between our vision of relationship and our deepest dreams and aspirations. It explains so many of the sort of romantic comedies in the world, the fantasies about how relationships are going to end, and it's in particularly true of a desacralized world, of a world that has kicked God out, how you know, bereft we are. There's a big God-shaped hole. And one would have to say, in popular culture, in the popular imagination, in many people's lives, the meaning of relationship has been overly exaggerated, has been elevated far too high. Qualities like solitude and introversion are perceived as kind of weird or problematic. Everything's fixated on relationships. If you were to read Cosmopolitan or watch Sex in the City or something, you'd think that the be all and end all of everything were one's relationships or how good one's sex life is. As if all these millennia of culture and also just the divine indwelling light within you is just fixated on that. It's a absolutely extraordinarily reductive way of visioning relationship. And it's actually part of this Libra Pisces inconjunct crisis of ultimate meaning, which if you lack that ultimate meaning, then the tendency is to overinflate other things instead. Now we see that overall, Pisces, Taurus form a yod through two inconjuncts to Libra. This whole process of how we relate to ourselves, this whole process of how we relate to others, Taurus to Libra, they all have a crisis with regard to ultimate meaning. It's it's either held in love or held in soul, or it's not. Most what was the quote? All problems are psychological, all solutions are spiritual. One clever soul said. Our deepest relationship to ourselves, our wounding, our emotional and psychological wounding, it's a crisis, really takes people into a crisis of ultimate meaning. So just as, actually let's back it up a second, just as you can read second house, Taurus, Venus for those core unconditioned needs, so you can read Libra, 7th house Venus for relationships. The kinds of people you're attracting or the kind of out-picturing or projection that's going on. So you can learn a lot. You could start a chart by reading the 7th house cusp, the descendant and the rulerships, and go in that way to see how this person projects meaning onto others, and to what extent and in what way and why. You can do the same with Pisces in the 12th house. You can see how we project our unresolved material about ourselves onto the divine, consciously or unconsciously. And what I've found is people tend to do this regardless of whether they believe in God or not. People can be absolute, fundamentalist atheists, which is not even that ironic a term, as it seems to me many modern day atheists obviously have a religious attitude to their atheism. Someone like Richard Dawkins or something is obviously, a religious fundamentalist, just in a sort of antimatter kind of way. Well, here you have the sense that even if you don't believe in God, one is projecting blame onto God, depending on whatever you feel is unfair about life. And I find, for example, you can look at charts here, Capricorn in the 12th house cusp, Saturn in Aquarius in the 1st. God is judgmental, cruel, or Neptune in Scorpio, opposite Venus in Taurus. And that's T square, that Saturn ruling the 12th. God is uncaring and cruel and tyrannical and punishing, and I know because I feel destroyed inside, and all my idealisms and all my projections onto relationship amounted to nothing. My intense disillusionment and unhappiness is proof that God is an unjust tyrant. And that was exactly this person's experience for many years. It's not any longer. In that sense of that Jung quote, you have to kind of withdraw that projection and take the 12th house ultimate canvas where you're painting your unresolved negative emotions onto the sky of the divine. And you have to withdraw it, compress it back into that second house. Here, actually, Pisces on the second, it was a process of forgiveness. It was a spiritual journey for this person to meet their own needs, to begin to self-care rather than self-harm. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to kind of add this Neptune layer that in a sense represents this whole field, this collective field in which we're engaged. And this field is permeable. So this lady goes from, self-harming and an active suicide risk to self-caring and self-nurturing. And all the people struggling with that issue in the world are subtly impacted by her transformative step. Whereas conversely, when she tried to commit suicide, 10 years ago, whatever it was, and almost succeeded, if she'd gone, she would have just added that extra subtle sense in the field, and another person succumbed, another person gave in to the wave of despair. We're influencing people all the time through our non-linear energy fields. Our unconscious is interfacing with this collective field. I'm calling it the collective field rather than the collective unconscious, because it also includes the collective consciousness. Neptune is, in a way, in this sense, philosophically and developmentally, it is a symbol of everything. It's the last archetype. It doesn't mean that Pisces people are just sorted in everything. That's a joke, confirmed by this Pisces. But really, it symbolically, as a last sign, it links Neptune to this collective level. Just out of interest, I don't know if you guys knew this, but this is the dream that Carl Jung had, in which, when he woke up and contemplated the dream, he realized the collective unconscious was being revealed to him. He's in this 18th century kind of study, taking this beautiful old staircase suddenly back into a 16th century style house, old heavy wooden furniture, and then, it's nice, but is there a cellar? And he goes down, bare walls, they get older and older, Roman bricks, masonry and mosaics, and then suddenly prehistoric remains, bones, skulls, and old pottery. It was then, at that moment, I got the idea of the collective unconscious. Very powerful realization. That symbolically, like when you look at the Grand Canyon and you see all the layers of rock and when they were deposited or whatever, he saw into the deep psyche. Now that's the horoscope. That's the birth chart. The birth chart has an 18th century type, has a 16th century old heavy furniture, has a cellar, has a Roman mosaic level, and it has prehistoric remains of bones, skulls, and old pottery. I genuinely believe the birth chart is a multi-dimensional event in time. And really, just to end this section really on Venus and Neptune in this way, I just wanted to reaffirm again something relating to this sense of essence as it operates in the collective dimension of the field, what I have taken to calling the knowing field. The knowing field. And I believe this knowing field operates, for example, in a reading. That actually one is not just reading the chart, one is not cold reading the person is not just sharing. All of those things are happening. They're reading you, you're reading them, you're reading the chart, they're reading their chart if they're a student of astrology. They're sharing about their life, you're having insights about them sharing about their life, they're having insights about that. All of those things are going on. But also the knowing field, the infinite field of reality, to the extent that some part of it is holographically present in that room at that point, is also reading the situation, is also aware, and the nonlinear field holds information. In fact, it holds more information than the chart. What I found is the birth chart can be a useful portal into that knowing field. And, at the essence of that knowing field, spiritually, at the heart of it, we have the truth of the first 3 lines of A Course in Miracles. And this is an incredibly validating truth. To hold this, even a fragment, even a tiny grain of sand, like particle of a fragment of the whole universe of this insight, just a tiny particle in your life will change it radically forever. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing real can be threatened. Your true self, your essence, is unthreatenable. Nothing can happen to it. We could all get gunned down, all of us listening to this now. The whole world could be destroyed in a nuclear event. It won't affect that part. How is that possible? I can't, the mind can't take that in. It's impossible to understand. And yet there's this powerful spiritual truth underlying it. And then alongside that, nothing unreal, nothing that's just formed by your own fear and anxiety and the desperate fantasies that your separate self pulls out to protect itself from reality. None of those exist anyway. Herein lies the peace of God. Herein lies spiritual equanimity, the total understanding that the real transcends everything. And actually, all you have to do is love truth. All you have to do is focus on the real. There's nothing else. All you have to do is really love reality, and everything else will just happen. If you just acknowledge what's really real, everything else unfolds. So I'm hoping we can see here that the Venus, Taurus second house, Libra seventh house, Pisces 12th house has something to say about the dynamic of a reading, even. You know, um, the value system we hold as astrologers, second house, Taurus, Venus, the way we relate to ourselves, then the way we hold the other, Libra 7th, the way they hold us, Libra 7th, from their Venus 2nd, and then this field, Neptune 12th, Pisces, that interaction is held within. These are, to me, reflections of deep-seated truths that contemplating them has just led me to find astrology a deeper and deeper practice. And I wanted to share that just, as an encouragement, really, that spiritual intention on that level seems to actually open astrology up so that the chart shows you more. That's what I found over time. And I find that myself even still an inspirational, even shocking insight, and one that really inspires me. And I hope it does you guys too.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Thank
Wow.
you, Mark.
For now. I remember an astrologer that one time really affected me. He said something to the nature of how it comes down to the chart or certain technical details in the chart, but in essence that the spiritual will and intention of what is happening between a client and an astrologer is the most important part of a reading, and I thought that was very profound.
I do think that's profound. You imagine, right? I remember this lady at, was it Norwalk? One of the conferences, I think it was Norwalk, who'd had a whole bunch of readings before she'd seen me, which I guess is revealing of something, isn't it? In one conference, I was like her third reading or something, and there was, I don't know, something like the nodes across the ninth third in Virgo Pisces or something like that, a discrimination issue about learning. But already just a couple of readings she'd had, and I'm sure these people were well-intentioned or even skillful, she was trying to deal with these different pieces of information she'd been given that were really quite different. I think it had literally gotten to this sort of absurd level where she'd taken from one reading, and I don't know if the astrologer had actually said this, you should move house. She'd taken it that way, and something like you should work with children or change your job to create. Anyway, I just said, what would it be like to forget astrology? What would it be like to ignore astrologers and remember your own true self and your power of your intuition? And she literally cried with relief. And then you realize that the intention you set on a deeper level, not just well-meaningness, but just like do no harm, some deep assent to who they really are, then you don't get quite so caught in seeming to have told them this or that can just lead people to chasing their tails, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mark.
Pleasure.
Um, let's just check in with everybody for a moment. Any questions on anything Mark has said? I'm seeing something come up if you'd like to handle it, Roy. Oh, my Judy. I'll unmute her. Miss Judy, hello.
Hi, Mark. You did a reading for me at the EA conference in Denver. It was the last moment just before I ran to the airport, and the
Yes.
whole reading was on Venus, and I
Yes.
just couldn't understand why. It didn't seem that important, and it totally shattered me. It totally, I mean, broke something open. I don't mean I was destroyed. I was just broken open in such a way that I was it was like I lost my whole concept of who I was or why I was because of the insight that you had and about this. And it took
Yes.
a long time to put it up to integrate it. But now I understand why you focused on Venus because of this particular talk you're doing today and how powerful it actually was. So I thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you, Judy. I mean, that's really good feedback to hear, and I'm glad you were able to, go through that kind of deep change. I mean, I don't. Obviously, sometimes that being broken open to really integrate on a new level is what happens, but it's a difficult journey to go on, and I don't always intend that for people. Sometimes it's a kind of consequence of what's discussed. I'm really glad it worked out for you, Judy, and you sound really well, and I'm really glad this helped contextualize the understanding I was using. Really glad. I mean, that's really why I prepare these presentations like this and put thought into how they evolve, because I do want to share that in that kind of step-by-step way, so it's a philosophical or psychological presentation, but also just a very technically simple method. I mean, really a technically simple method that
Mm-hmm.
that is actually, profound quite quickly, I feel. Thank you.
Judy might have something else to say. I'm gonna unmute her one more time, Leroy. Were you done, Judy?
No, I did have one more little bit, and that was that I think the effect of it was because it was after the whole conference. It was the last moment before leaving to go to the airport and get on the airplane. I was, of course, exhausted because of the whole, an EA conference can really rip your guts out, and probably it was probably because of that that it went so deeply in because I was so vulnerable and so open and
Yes.
so kind of shattered. And I may not have been able to hear it as well if I had been in full control of my capacities. I might have blocked it. But
Yes.
but it was profound. And thank you again. And amen.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting the way that readings evolve out of certain contexts? That we were all in that shared field together in that time, and even uh, the timing, the seeming accidental timing of readings at the end of that, just on the way to the airport, it's all taking part in this huge collective field, which is way beyond the control of even the most profound astrologer or the most dedicated or authentic client or student. You know, there's a Neptune level in these things. There's a non-linear level, the outer planet kind of level, holding these kinds of things sometimes. So that, yeah, they just you got to. There's always going to be something going on in an astrology reading that's way beyond even the best astrologer in the world's will or control. So the sooner we can drop the fantasy that we can understand everything about the birth chart or can control the outcome of readings, other than just to pay attention and serve the client alongside the deep symbolism of the chart. I think the sooner we can do that as students, the more liberated we get. We can drop this fantasy that you have to know everything about the chart, or that there's this magical answer you're looking for when you look at the chart, um,
Mm-hmm.
and
Exactly.
learn to trust that larger process that the reading is occurring within.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks again, Judy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I muted her. Oh, we've got another one, Leroy.
Mark, would you tend to look to progress to Venus? Robin asks to understand more about the process of loving, relating to ourselves, and how our needs are evolving.
I think you could look at it as one of the many factors of how it evolves over time. If you place progressions and solar arcs in the context of very significant transit activity, to me, I guess the one very useful product of studying with Noel Till was how he taught to look for these times when very major transit activity supports progressions and solar arcs. So I would look for the times, if you're looking at something like a Venus progression, if it changes sign or goes retrograde or doesn't go retrograde, or its movement coincides with very significant transit activity. So generally that's how I look at progressions. But I do believe you could almost ignore all but the most basic of core transit activity in a way, if you have a deep enough resonance with the natal imprint. If you understand natal Venus second house in this way we've been talking about, if you understand natal Pluto eighth house, the nodes, things that other people have spoken about during this conference and in other evolutionary astrology conferences, then that information will emerge, whatever. But yes, the simple answer is yes, and in particular to look for shifts in sign, direct, retrograde. But for me, the most significant thing is to see when it aligns with major transit activity. Because the progressions and solar arcs are kind of like an internal clock hand. And when they correspond, they're based on internal timings, rules within the chart itself, spinning within itself. When they correspond with the transit picture, the actual movement of or the symbolic movement of the sky, that's to me when really critical windows open.
Oh,
If that makes sense. Yeah.
And you could even look at, this collective transit of Venus retrograde, collective transit of Neptune retrograde. Those are those opportunities when all of us are doing it, perhaps Venus individually, Neptune collectively.
Yeah, Kim, could you say, just for me, as I don't always ponder these things in this way, what would your view be of like a Venus retrograde period collectively? Just like as an individual, a Venus retrograde period is going on in the sky. What does it
It's the
suggest?
time
Like, go on.
it's the time period to go within and
Yes.
review everything that we value, what's no longer serving our soul, what is it time to shed. And of course, you have the details via the sign, the house, the aspects that are activated through this. And germane to what you're saying, look at how it offers us an opportunity to redo relationship, not only internally with ourselves, but then how we outpicture it with others, how we relate to someone outside of ourselves, everyone outside of ourselves. I I I just don't think we value Venus enough. You know, I myself in particular had always had a fascination with the outer planets because they were so deep, they were so unconscious, and I had this Scorpio nature that always asked why. And as time has went on, I've learned to recognize, don't discount those faster moving inner planets. There's no better representation of self-love than Venus. And Venus retrograde is that opportunity to love self better first, and everything else comes from there.
What's your take on Venus retrograde natally, Kim?
We have taken in too much of other and societal values. And so we're trying to throw off a lot of that conditioning of how to be in a relationship and
Yeah.
who to relate to. And so Venus retrograde is trying to say, well, who am I? And how do I want to be in a relationship? And it does require an ability to search for your own values and not what society says, the white picket fence or the gender issues. I mean, I think Venus can encompass all of that kind of stuff. I had a client, I had spoke about this client earlier this week. He pops in and he's popping in again. He had Venus in the second house in Aquarius. And when Neptune came along, that Neptune transit, as it works so long over, any planet that it touches by transit, as transiting Neptune and Aquarius went over that natal Venus, he recognized his homosexuality. And at
Yeah.
that time, that gentleman was either his late 50s or early 60s. He's a long-term client. And that ability of him to make that gender awakening, as you say, that value, Venus, Aquarius second house, and to break free. He was a Vietnam vet. He found
Wow.
his inspiration and his connection to source energy again that has just totally transformed his life. I mean, he suffered sexual abuse. He had a lot of anger. He had a lot of weight issues. And Roy knows who I'm talking about. He's a local client, so he comes in person. And if you saw him today, you'd think he was 20 years younger. Just totally transformed his life. So again, I'm moving from Venus retrograde by transit to Venus retrograde natally to
Yes.
just the beautiful evolution that we make when we acknowledge our Venus, our own
I
inner
think that take
values.
on that take on Venus retrograde is really good, actually. Um,
Hmm.
Throwing off conditioning values. I mean, just as an
Hmm.
aside, I know it's not quite the subject, but would you say that about all retrograde planets then? Something, say, like Mars retrograde, the will has taken on too many voices blocking its true direction, and you have to go within and find it? Or
Hmm.
would you apply that principle of liberating from
In
conditioning to other retrograde placements as well?
Oh yes, yes. In general, any natal retrograde planet is about throwing off the conditioning of the past.
That's great.
And with Mars, many times with Mars is will, Mars is action. And so sometimes what we end up doing is, oh, sweet, looky there. There you are, Mars.
Yeah. Oh, I remember that shirt. I like that shirt. I no longer have it, sadly.
Mars can be, you know, we've been too willful or we've been too impulsive. And so throwing off that conditioning, Mars retrograde natally is about being conscious of choosing how to will oneself forward.
Yes.
But yeah, oh,
Can you,
Roy's coming up to
just for
speak.
me, just out of interest, Kim, will
Hmm.
you just talk a little
Hmm.
bit more about that with some other placements? You've just struck a real chord of insight. For example, whilst I had sort of heard that idea, I'd never heard it as clearly as you just said it, quite genuinely now. I mean, I looked at Venus retrograde, say sometimes in some conditions, as needing to meet certain people again, or the Mars retrograde as the internalization of the will, but I'd never linked it quite so clearly with the point you're making about having become full of other people's ideas about it potentially. Yes, the idea of being over willful and internalizing, but the idea that one could have, I guess I'd seen it sometimes with Mercury retrograde, the idea you could have taken on too many ideas, and now you've just got to sort out what's most important. But you just helped me understand a couple of charts quite genuinely on them, particularly that Mars retrograde point and the Venus retrograde point, really shaking off conditioning. So it's a Uranian impulse slightly, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, totally, totally. And it's very, geocentric. It's very Earth-centered, and nothing against sidereal astrology. I think all methods of astrology work. But here on Earth, we are so trying to understand ourselves that retrograde phenomena, as we observe it, it's a beautiful rhythm to allow us to throw off past, to throw off conditioning, whether this life, past lives, or all of the above.
I mean, it's a really radically kind of quite a positive transformational vision of retrogradation, which is sometimes seen as, you know, really quite intensely problematic. Or
Hmm. Hmm. My own personal example, I have, and I'll get into, I don't, we'll get into a chart example, everybody, but if you allow us to be a little freeform here a little bit. In my own chart, I have Sun, Mercury, Neptune, 1 to 2 Scorpio, and it's direct. Mercury's direct. Um, and okay, hold on a second here. I'm gonna move a couple of things over, and then I can show
oh, I
you.
like
But
that picture.
anyway, I'll come back to it. Just a moment, everybody. Oops. Did have my there's a little right here. Here's my chart. Here's my chart, everybody. Um, so studying astrology now for 30 some years, just over 30 years, I got to that point where I used to just fear Mercury retrograde. My eighth house, Pluto, Virgo, so much work, so much effort, and I would either have Mercury retrograde come in like a lamb, go out like a lion, or vice versa. And so at one point, I could remember in my life somewhere in the last 10 years, I don't remember exactly which Mercury retrograde, but I finally got to the point of saying, wait a minute, Mercury retrograde is not about the workload increasing, Kimberly. It's about you throwing it off. And of course, you see it so close there to Neptune. And so when I made that recognition, Mercury got to surrender to Neptune. And now when Mercury retrogrades come along, yes, I might get that little trigger or message, here it comes, but I'm like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Mercury retrograde is about slowing down. It's about reaching over to that polarity opposite Sag and Pisces and slowing down and finding what thoughts really matter. How do I really want to process information? How do I really want to go through the moments in my day? And I've been able to take Mercury retrogrades from being hair on fire, again, my Pluto signature, my South Node, third house, and that Mercury stellium, and now I'm able to, it's not to say I don't have some mercurial chaos during the Mercury retrogrades, but I've learned how to calm them down for myself, and then allow that Mercury retrograde to bring me inspiration, to feel inspired, to feel a sense of wholeness rather than the chaos. So there's the example of Mercury retrograde and throwing off conditioning, my personal example.
It's very interesting. And just looking at your chart, the Saturn transit right now, on the North Node and Midheaven, as here we are linking across thousands of miles through what you guys set up as the embodiment of the new look evolutionary astrology network, created, envisioned, and brought into form as Saturn went across all that incredible intense spot in early Scorpio, which is, basically just a degree off my midheaven. Yeah, it's very profound, actually, what you've done with the teaching and the archive you guys have created, which is a phenomenal value and asset to students.
And here we are just starting
That's
with
it's
our new
amazing.
webinar medium. I
Yes.
just love this. I mean, we've connected over Skype so many times, but that's been the thing over this week. There's been some intensity this week, and so I've actually, the chart examples that I have told Mark, let's work with these examples, and I'll move us into these examples.
Before you go, Kim, what would you say about your, don't want to put you on the spot or anything, but just that Aquarius, Cancer, Sag that you've circled, what?
Well, I'll tell you what, for me, with this Aquarian signature here, and you see the ruler over here in the second, square the nodes, all right? And you see the planets in the 11th house. I run trauma so close to the surface that my husband and son come around the corner and I jump 3 feet. And and yet for me, as you look at with the potpourri houses, I have Pisces completely intercepted in that. and
Yes.
the Neptune right there. And so as I've worked with myself and I've learned to really work with a sense of detaching from this sense of the traumatized soul, then it's allowed me to really, in essence, get in touch more and more with that deeper spiritual side of myself that's underneath all the trauma layers of the patriarchy. So it's allowed me to come into my more authentic self and more into my truth. My situation was when I first discovered evolutionary astrology, my personal curiosity and love was the evolutionary states of consciousness. When I ran across that in EA, it was like coming home for me, because although I suffered no physical abuse in this life, I suffered a lot of verbal, a lot of emotional, mental abuse. And from an authoritarian father who at this point I can see was just his own wounded self. However, I didn't know that as a child. And so I could remember being this emerging teenager and thinking, something's not right with my father. My father's not normal. And when I was in my early 20s, I found out how my father actually died, or how my paternal grandmother actually died. When my father was about 12, 13 years old, that Saturn opposition, my grandfather ended up hitting my grandmother. She knocked her head on the cast iron kitchen stove and never regained consciousness.
Wow.
Today my grandfather would have ended up in jail. At that point in time, this is back in the um, early 40s, at that point in time, the family minister swept it under the rug. Children were never allowed to process or grieve it. And my dad was the middle of a family of 7. So therein, so when I learned that in my 20s, that was a real major awakening for me. I wasn't even into astrology then yet. I didn't know, I wasn't even, I never looked at an astrology book. But it just in my own soul, it was like, oh my gosh, my father had passed all of his unresolved trauma and anger, on to his own family because he was never allowed to process through it.
Yeah.
So the Aquarian archetype has went from all of the trauma, which I still process through, the past lives of it, and allowing my soul to take it on for whatever reasons, to then going into that Aquarian detachment, objectivity, which has given me unbelievable freedom, being able to move away from a lot of that. Now when, someone walks around the corner and I jump 3 feet, I laugh. I've moved away from a lot of that energy. And the ruler, Uranus over there, square the nodes. I was raised with that children are meant to be seen, not heard. Even though, again, I wasn't physically touched, it was what's that saying? Spare the rod, spoil the child. So there was absolutely no acknowledgement as to who I essentially was. And of course, coming into the typical consensus family. I had a very spiritual mother. I see her as moving into first stage spirituated. She was my source of sanity. Um, again, I was the oldest of 3 girls. I had my sister who was 3 years younger. We never knew from one moment to the next when my father was just going to drop into rage. And it happened almost all the time. There was never peace. And so this ability to capture an essence of who I was, and what happened then with that, looking at that 7th house cusp,
Yes.
Cancer, Moon, a lot of emotional suppression, and then as I moved early into relationships, there was so much emotional projection onto partners. There was so much emotional neediness projected onto partners. In high school, I was so intense. I was very quiet in many ways, but there would be such an intensity that, I'd have myself married by the third date, and I scared the hell out of anybody I dated. And because I was so emotionally needy and projecting so much of it onto them. And as a matter of fact, if you don't mind this story, when Pluto went into Scorpio and went over that stellium, that is when my ex left me for my best friend. And that's when I found astrology. And that's when, talk about that Plutonian metamorphosis. I still went through a few projections of neediness onto relationships, but each one was getting me to that point where I finally was able to take that emotional neediness of the seventh house and that intensity of its ruler up there, and the square in my chart. You see the crescent square from Moon Pluto, and I was able to turn that into the Mama Kim as I'm known today. I was able to access back down into that second house, a total inner relationship with source energy, not from my Christian upbringings and the fear and the judgment and all that kind of stuff. I was able to transfer it into real deep communion with source that then allowed me to turn that seventh house cusp and the moon on the 10th into, again, sooner or later I get that nickname Mama Kim.
Well, and also you manifest a relationship where core emotional safety is present. Cancer on the
Yes,
7th, the real need, and you guys even work together, Moon and Scorpio on the 10th, doing something deep and committed in the world, linking to this newfound faith and freedom spiritually at
yes,
the heart of you, the true teacher, Sag on the 12th, the vision you had. I think that's
yes,
actually rather beautiful, and I think you spoke about it with genuine Aquarius on the second house cusp. Um, Detachment and insight there, actually, really rather profound. Kim, how did you get into astrology during that crazy Pluto
oh,
transit to everything in Scorpio?
I
What
I
happened?
was I was going berserk. My ex fell in love with my best friend, and she was married, and they had a young child, and we were good friends. And so it kind of happened over the space of a few months, and all of a sudden your words blown. At that point, I was still going to church. My minister. That's when I walked away from the church because the platitudes I was given was like, okay, I'm done with this stuff. And I went doing all the psychology research in the library. It helped, and my soul kept going, I still don't get it. I still don't get it. That big why you can see from all the Scorpio. I had not discovered reincarnation yet. And I was in a bookstore. I ran into a sun sign astrology book, and it went through the 12 signs describing the positive and negative traits of each of the 12 signs. I read the negative traits of Scorpio and went, oh, this is it. And then I just spent, like, I don't know, I would say 2, 3 years just immersed in astrology books. I moved, and I moved to the western part of the state, to the mountains, and I just got every astrology book I could find and studied and studied and studied. And it was about 2 years into it, went to my first conference. There was some hippie guy lecturing on Pluto. I ran to the bookstore. He had one opening left for a reading, and that was my first astrology reading with Jeffrey.
Wow.
Hmm. But it was the negative traits of the Scorpio that hit me like a light bulb, because that's how I felt. That was the wound.
So it was a Pluto hit right from the off.
Hmm.
And I must add, as she worked her way through, studying with Jeffrey and of course the Pluto books and the evolution of her own soul, since that core trauma, that core family trauma that permeates her entire biological family, by the way. Uh,
Oh yeah, it's real
now,
fun.
now she's evolved to where that objectivity is so present in how she's able to be with clients in an objective yet compassionate way. Pisces intercepted in the second, and then that Cancer that was projected out there in the seventh house to relationships previously now is the empath.
Yes.
And so there's this
I
sacred
resonate.
space that opens up for Kim with clients that I appreciate.
Yeah, I've appreciated it too. I mean, right from the first time that I worked with you guys in conferences, there was just always a sense of being safe or being held in a certain way. I totally see that Cancer signature and coming through the professional commitment, Moon in Scorpio on the 10th, because actually deep commitment produces safety on some level, and especially with a signature like this, it's like you trust because you know the person's committed. And like the kind of self-reflection you just gave, extraordinarily lucid, quite complex, but explained simply and clearly about yourself. It is like a natural detachment. I mean, I'm an Aquarius second house cusp and a Sag on the 12th, but I'm a Gemini on the 7th, and Mercury conjunct North Node in Aquarius in the second. And I know that kind of detachment in that sense. My mind has never really been very personal like that. I don't tend to, I mean, obviously I've taken some things personally in life, but I don't tend to think things through in a personal fashion to the extent that on my psychosynthesis training, transpersonal psychotherapy training, my friend and colleague on the course, we were making up native Indian names for ourselves, and mine was strange abstract shape. Um, instead of like, brave otter dancing or running bear, it was strange abstract shape because of that Aquarian detachment thing. And yeah, I really resonate with it.
Interesting.
I think, yeah, I like the way you talk about charts actually. Um, I and I think the way you just spoke about the second, seventh, 12th was remarkably clear. Um, I don't know if there's any others, Kim. I mean, it's certainly it's putting together what I was trying to create the philosophical context for in a
Yes,
really
it is.
dynamic kind of way, isn't it?
Sure,
Astrologically.
sure. We've got a little more time. Let's hold on. Beings we popped into my chart. Let's look at this guy. And oh, by the way, I just had happened to put Dark Moon Lilith and Hygeia in the charts in the last couple of days because of those of you who heard Tom Lesher speak on Dark Moon Lilith. Leroy and I were, as we were listening, we're going, where's ours? And so we just have popped those in the last 2 days and been playing with them. Leroy, do you want me to describe you, or would you like to do it?
Oh, I
He's
guess I'm
muted
interested
again.
in your read on it, as a matter of fact. Yeah, go ahead. Uh, well,
Well,
in essence, I just, again, you mentioned earlier it was Leo on the second, but of course, as you can see now, Cancer is the sign on that second house cusp, and I've always been, that core essential self that Mark was so eloquently describing earlier in his talk, was very powerful in my life simply because that essential need to be recognized as an emotional human being was never allowed in my critical upbringing. My parental upbringing was somewhat critical. You can see that Virgo square the nodes. The planetary ruler of the nodal axis actually square the nodes. Somewhat sitting there on the fourth house cusp, of course, home and family. And there was a very critical nature to my parental communication, let alone how it impacted me. So, a lot of the traditional messages, that we're all used to growing up with, which is, primarily for me was, well, why are you crying? I'll give you something to cry about, right? So that was the essence from dad. Mom, somewhat, again, the bickering household is how I would describe my family upbringing. So never really given permission to be the sensitive male, because there's always too much work to do, too many baseball games to play, too much to focus on, right? As we work through life. So that was the big aha in listening to Mark today was, of course, that essential self is so represented by that second house cusp. And then, of course, the ruler of that second house cusp, Moon and Scorpio, a lot of depth, a lot of emotional depth. In the fifth house, all my creativity might be tied to, tapping into the depth and the essence of that inner male, inner child, even, so, as I guess on that, looking at how I look at that Capricorn on the 7th is basically projected. I sought mentors, and usually in the form of a baseball coach or somebody to replace the critical father on some level, and developed relationships in that way. So that's the essence of how I kind of have absorbed this second, 7th, 12th lessening in terms of how it's affected my relationships. I'm not sure. Kim's got a lot of Capricorn in her chart too. Maybe that's why how she comes in somehow with that Capricorn on the
Or
7th.
yeah, if you don't mind if I share. I mean, again, Leroy and I, even though I was born in San Francisco, my father got out of the military, moved back to the Northern Plains when I was 6 months old. So Leroy and I were basically raised by parents from the dirty 30s where there was not enough food on the table and you did not spend a penny, and grew up with those types of messages. And both of us have German fathers. And so all of the scarcity, the lack, the control, the out picturing, they're both Pluto cancers, all the out picturing of their own wounds. And Leroy, how I see it from you, early on with and in my family, father was a bitch, but mother was an angel. In Leroy's family, he had two parents who tried to outbitch each other. And even to this day, in their early 80s, Leroy's the third out of four. The four adult children finally get up. Okay, I'm leaving now. I'm not going to put up with this bitching anymore. And Leroy did that a month or so ago. Anyway, with that whole collapse of that sensitive male, a lot of what would happen, what I seen in your early relationships, Leroy, with that Capricorn on the descendant, Saturn, Scorpio, 6th, is you would choose these unavailable women. Leroy had a fiance who committed suicide on him. Leroy had a fiance who tried to get him to pass her sister's husband child off as his. Leroy broke off the relationship. So there's a lot of this outpicturing of all of the woundedness, the unavailability of the Capricorn, or the you in another chart, that Capricorn 7th house cusp could be a partner wanting the partner to take on all the responsibility. But I saw it as you choosing these unavailable partners who wanted to scapegoat to you, Saturn 6. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that 12th house cusp, for you, there's this deep essential need to find your own sense of well-being in reconnecting with source energy, and then knowing that you're safe with source. That 12th house, that Taurus on that 12th house cusp, and Venus right there on that just inside the ascendant. I mean, as you discovered your own spiritual path, and Leroy was well into his own spirituality by the time we finally connected in our later wise years, as your mother called it. You know, this was you finding your own inner self-reliance and your own sensitivity as you opened up your own spiritual path, which then allowed you to become that sensitive male, or as I call it, the matriarchal man.
I think that's a fair read.
You feel that's accurate, honey?
Yeah. Yeah, that
Mm-hmm.
Saturn Scorpio, of course, ruler of the
That's
seventh
deep.
house cusp,
And you,
is pretty deep. Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
it is, isn't it? Well, and that loss, the grief as well from the past, to be so sensitive, the Cancer on the second house cusp, so naturally sensitive, the Venus in Cancer on the ascendant, ruling the 12th, you know, it's both an essential part of your core relationship to your second house needs, but it's also your, you know, it's true spiritual impulse, isn't it? The sensitivity, and to grow up under such um, argumentative, destructive vision of roles and burden and hierarchy. You know, Capricorn in the sense of duty and hierarchy imposed on you rather than love, rather than warmth, and the kind of unresolved grief expressing through, you know, the one who couldn't bear to be in this world, and then any guilt or burden, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that, as Kim said, tried to scapegoat through passing something off, living a lie, essentially. Um,
Mm.
these temptations to your integrity, really, which you didn't succumb to. And then Taurus on the 12th, that you really are a survivor, really a genuinely, powerfully, like spiritually a survivor. Even that, so a sensitive man can carry tremendous courage and integrity, you know, more than many a so-called macho man, you know. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
actually profound personal examples, guys. I mean, and really, I'm just sat here. I love the way you've circled those cusps. I'm just sat here looking at that weird yod formation and finding myself, yeah, it's just illuminating the astrology so clearly.
Um, as we've turned out to be the example, Mark, let's give him an example of this one. This is our composite chart. How many of you knew we had Pluto square the nodes?
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we both have Scorpio moons. So there's the composite Scorpio moon. So as you can see, we have the signs on the natural houses in our chart. And any of you who've not heard us on the podcast, Pluto in Capricorn's going over the midheaven 5 times. You hear my voice? 2013-14, hence the evolution of the conference to a webinar and the website needing to reinvent itself. Next year, Uranus over the ascendant 3 times. Stay tuned, everybody. We don't know where we're quite going to go next. But when you see those natural signs on their natural houses, as a couple, as a relationship, you see how there's a core essence for our relationship to really develop inner self-reliance. With Pluto square the nodes, you can see how over past lives we have battled back and forth between self-reliance and codependency with each other. The joke was when we met, when Leroy and I did first meet, we had a dear friend who's now in spirit world, but she was a psychic, and she was one of our connections, and she told us early on in our relationship, oh, well, the last time I saw you together, let's just say you were in Kansas in the Prairie days, and Kimmery, you were the male, Leroy, you were the female, and we had similar children as we do a child and nieces and nephews, and I was the fur trapper, and I left and never came back. And so the joke was in the first few years of our relationships, because Leroy has graciously chosen to come in and help me not only with my astrology and take it into what we've created it today. He's also helped me with another business that I have and expanded that one as well. Well, my joke was when we first met, honey, I got the furs this time. But the whole thing is, as you can see, with that south node in the second house, that ruler Venus, you see that over there. Again, the core essential need for us as a couple, for each of us to develop our own self-reliance, independent of each other. And so many conversations around that, as with that 8th house polarity point and Scorpio there, and that Moon North Node conjunction. I mean, you hear us as we're all in our smiley faces on the podcast, but don't be fooled. There's a lot of intensity in this household, and there's a lot of confrontation that the two of us as a couple do with each other. We're very good at pointing out each other's blind spots. At least we can laugh about it, right, honey?
Hey.
But, and then, look at that 7th house cusp. We could either continue to project all that neediness out there, or blame the other with the ruler Venus in there in that stellium. Thank goodness. I mean, there was been when Uranus was in Pisces and opposed that stellium, there was a little intensity then, and we really had to work through the whole work issues of the household. I mean, we're together 24/7, which, as many of you might recognize, is not a very easy thing to do. And we both recognize that there has to be fairness, there has to be equality. That is a moving understanding. But we also both recognize that we each must have interest outside of the house, purely on our own, that does not involve the other one. We have a great love of hiking together. We love to do that. We do a lot of it. Those are our walk and talks. But Leroy has his interest outside the house. I have mine, so that we get a break from each other, so that we can continue to evolve that 7th house cusp of searching for fairness, equality, because one of the dangers of a composite 5th house Pluto, not only in the 5th house, but 2957 Leo, is who's more important. And so, being the first astrologer and in the family, and having to really encourage and allow Leroy the space to come out and be that as well, to allow him to find his own creativity. Lots of discussions about, will we both continue with these businesses? Will we both continue to work together? Maybe Leroy, with all of his Leo energy, needs to find something outside of astrology again at some day. There's that need to reach over to that Aquarian polarity point. And oh, by the way, we've just seen Dark Moon Lilith and Hygeia here just since yesterday with Tom's lecture. So for those of you who caught that lecture, there it is right there on that polarity point. The healing, the bringing out the matriarchal stuff that we do with both of our businesses, the astrology and the energetic balancing, leading edge of spiritual healing, not to mention that trickling down into mental, emotional, physical levels as well. And then, of course, the 12th house cusp and ruler Neptune, 0 degrees Scorpio, really going for deep psychological depth and understanding, not only in our relationship, but how we share it with others in the world, but then each of us using our own spiritual connection to source energy. I mean, I must say that I feel blessed, because Leroy's really the first partner I've ever had who could just go wherever I want to go in spiritual conversations, and I'm extremely grateful for that, honey.
Oh, I am too.
Okay, panelist, Mark. Okay, honey, did you mute Mark? If you mute Mark, he can't unmute himself. Oh, no, we don't see you muted, Mark. Look for your little, Leroy, you're an organizer. Can you unmute Mark? Leroy, you there?
He's unmuted on my panel, so I'm a little confused. Mark, are you there? We'll get you up. Even if you have to leave and re-enter, muting, unmuting. How about that, Mark? Are you still there? Perhaps you need to find your little orange background with the white horizontal arrow and expand that and see what you can do to unmute yourself on your control panel, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. The orange control, the control panel with the icons is that white arrow with the orange behind it, and the first icon underneath it is your microphone. So we have you unmuted, Mark, and if you can't figure it out, you are welcome to leave, go find your email link, come back in, and it'll reset everything. As we wait for Mark, because I would love to have his opinion, do we have comments or questions from anybody? Are you seeing this as example well enough? Leroy, I'll let you run the board.
Well, yeah, we've getting a comment. Thank you, Judy. It's
Oh, Mark's taking a little break.
Gotcha.
Mark needed to go you know where after we've been sitting here for 4 hours. So I do see a question raised. Somebody has a hand raised. Terry Z, I will unmute you, honey. Terry? Miss Terry? I have you unmuted, Terry, but perhaps you don't have your...
I apologize, I had myself muted.
That's okay. Hi,
Can
honey.
can you put your chart back up for a second? I had a question there.
Sure. There you go.
Yeah, if we remember Mark's comment that I thought was so valuable about that second house cusp, this is the pearl. This is your true self. I think we talked a lot, or I heard you talk a lot um, about the trauma signature in Uranus, but I'm seeing that a little differently. I'm seeing that is who you are. You came in individuated. You came in genius. You came in objective. With the Lilith in Pisces in that same house, I just think you had to kind of catch up with yourself, and then of course naturally being coming into the consensus family, everything else you said I understood perfectly. But I think I wanted to point out the pearl. That is who you are. And you mentioned that Leroy was the first partner you've ever had who will let you go anywhere that you want to go. So his sweetheart nature and his own intelligence level creates an opportunity for you to experience that unrecognized part of you, probably from childhood. How what a beautiful soul you were as you came in.
Thank you. Thank you very
Yeah.
much for that. And look at how Terry, just pointing out what Terry had said, look at how the ruler of the second house cusp, Uranus, is square the nodes and the skip steps within the soul. And any planet square the nodes is where the soul has to play catch up. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate you pointing that out, Terry.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Comments, questions with anything? Leroy, you running the board for me, honey?
Yeah,
Unmute
Judy.
Terry.
Judy, of course, is just complimenting us on the fact that it doesn't, we're not trying to put a smiley face on our relationship, but it's a real relationship in process or progress, truly. Yeah, and appreciate that comment, Judy. We're just we're celebrating the first year anniversary of becoming full-time co-parents again of an
Yeah,
18-year-old now, an
love
18-year-old
it.
next month. And so that's been part of our scorpionic growth over the last year, is having my son's mother, of course, passed away a year ago today. So
Yeah, it was a year ago today that we were heading down a car, heading down to Georgia for 2 weeks, going, oh, this is shifting things. So there was Saturn and Scorpio on Leroy's Neptune moon in the fifth house, and my stellium. And of course, for any of you who are not aware of this, at the same time, I was having my teacher of evolutionary astrology for 30 years telling me I couldn't do an astrology conference. That was going on behind the scenes in the midst of it all. So it was, yeah, it's very sweet to get to this 1 year later, media monk, and to laugh again, and to go, whoa, a minute through all that Scorpio stuff, and our kid even likes us.
Well, and you see, don't you, Kim, like the way, I don't know, like the Uranus square to the nodes here and the Scorpio in the ninth, the way you had to evolve truly into your own power rather than surrendering it to the other in the seventh, integrating into your essential power within your power and strength of your mind and your communication, integrating South Node Taurus in the third, and then this incredible, you know, vision that you yourself have rather than just being dependent on, you know,
Mm-hmm.
an inspirational, if problematic other who struggles perhaps on their side to let go of any projected expectation or dependency.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the thing, people themselves begin to feed off the projections of others because of unresolved aspects in their own Venus, Taurus, second house, core self relationship. So paradoxically, sometimes we can get quite attached to people projecting onto us,
Mm-hmm.
the partner that doesn't want the other person to change. It used to be a joke on our therapy training. If someone's in a relationship when they start the therapy training, how will the relationship transform, or how will it end? you know, um, because it's a struggle to keep a pace with other people's transformation. And I really see like a powerful and in sort of evolutionary intended shift in your relationship to your power as a teacher. That scorpionic transformation in the ninth, where it goes from being the service orientated, the servant of depth, Pluto Virgo in the eighth,
Mm-hmm.
to this inner recognition, like you say, of your core relationship to Source, Pisces polarity, and you, the Neptune close to the North Node and midheaven to Mercury and Sun, your depth coming through as a teacher, your clarity as a teacher, and much more a teacher, whilst, much has been inspirational and even visionary in some of the founding material of the astrology that we're dedicated to. The actual teaching part outside of just the archetype of being a teacher, the actual just like, hands-on teaching part, I don't think has ever been served so well. You guys pay attention to archiving material, how students are going to get it, breaking it down, diagrams, patient questions, panels, interactive group process, and I think that was something missing in the slightly Old Testament prophet kind of early days of evolutionary astrology, to be honest.
Nice way. Nice thinking, Mark. A nice way of saying that. Oh, here's a good comment. I'm going to go back to our composite chart. Thank you, Judy. In order to complete the karma of your dysfunctional childhood families, you get to be the full-time parents now. And yes, definitely what's going on right here for us with all of that. Mm.
and raising
Mm-hmm.
a first house Pluto child with strong South Node in Aries and strong Sagittarius in the
Oh,
first, he's always right. He doesn't, it's very challenging not to be to,
Oh,
to pass on the same dysfunctional parenting that you referred to, Judy. So we're doing, you never know how you're being as a parent. I'll promise you, but doing the best that we can, I guess.
oh yeah. If you don't mind, as we just finish up, let's just put this one in here. And just, here we go, everybody. This is our little karmic soul that uh, we are working our way through. And so look at, as we work with, let's just do the 2nd, 7th, 12th on him. I'll try and be as objective as possible. We might need your help, Mark. There's this little core desire for freedom and truth. Where the ruler is, where Venus is. Out picturing of security. I'm seeing that once in a while. Sometimes I feel too close to be objective to my own kid. All my own emotion is going here, and I'm a little sensitized today because it was an emotional morning. Yes, it's been indeed an emotional 2 days processing through because Forrest's mother was one of my best friends. I'm getting emotional right now, and she was the one who introduced me to Leroy. She was just a gift who came through. Leroy, your turn. I gotta put myself back together.
Well, I guess I was curious on Mark's read on that on this Taurus on the 7th and Libra on the 12th house cusp. I look at the ruler of that 2nd house cusp as its desire for freedom, but it's also the Mr. Know-it-all. And again, yeah, it's hard to be real objective with your kid when you get to interact with him kind of sparsely as they move away from the nest, so to speak, at 18, going on 18 next November 3rd, as a matter of fact, in less than a month. So, or about a month and 4 or 5 weeks actually. But I am very interested, Mark. Can you give a read on the 2-7-12 with this chart?
I was just checking some of his quite interesting planetary node placements, but let's just steer away that for a moment. So yeah, I mean, not knowing him or how to fix his consciousness, what I would observe, I mean, the first house in which the ruler of the 2nd house cusp is, that it's almost like a freedom fighter placement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pluto, last degree Scorpio, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Sag. It's like, um, do or die kind of warrior mentality, like fight for freedom. And the Mars placement, widely conjunct Jupiter, the ruler of the 2nd house, is on the south node of Uranus, which is a slightly left field thing, but it's something I'm researching at the moment for a book, and I have an article out in the Mountain Astrologer in the Christmas edition on the planetary nodes and showing how the planets themselves evolve as archetypes and how they link back into history. But suffice it to say, it emphasizes the Uranian element. So you have this Sagittarius collision essentially in the 1st house, like warrior mentality, and yet quite quickly into the 2nd house you go into Capricorn, and this Neptune-Uranus conjunction and some kind of grief or trauma, perception perhaps of the world being a kind of tyranny, or the imposition of authority upon him is a tyranny.
Yeah.
And that's what squares the nodes, So that's the huge unresolved crisis. And of course, the reason partly linking the Mars is so significant is because it's conjunct the 2nd house ruler, but it's also the ruler of the south node. And this is his kind of warrior crisis that this boy comes in with, really. And perhaps the kind of survival mentality he's pictured out onto the world, that he has to keep himself to himself or deal with things, and really the stability he's trying to unconsciously evoke from others in order to kind of protect him.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I've always been curious about, that Capricorn square, the nodal axis. Those heavy hitter planets there, and there's so many of these teenagers walking around right now on the planet that somewhat, look at avoiding responsibility as almost a dictum in their life. It's not in its, or there's just a resistance to being completely and utterly responsible for oneself at all times. It's almost like that got way out of vogue somewhere, where whoever was saying that was some kind of crazy man. So, yet wanting to
But you
be
see,
eternally free.
yeah. Well, this is it. Well, this is the freedom fighter mentality I was picking up from the first house. And you
Well,
see, go on. Sorry.
let me interject, Mark,
Yes.
that as Roy and I have observed this soon to be 18-year-old I met him at 1 year old, so I've known him for 17 years. We pretty much have come to the conclusion that he is third consensus transitioning into first individuated.
Yeah.
So it's that reversal of being born into the consensus environment and you're trying to break free. We have that opposite condition going on in our household. And so just natural observation of this child, it's not, who is God? It's there's a lot of rejection of spirituality.
Well, you
And
see the Neptune-Uranus trauma signature in Capricorn. There's a lot of grief and disillusionment there, and
mhm,
some kind of, you know, life-ending trauma in the past, probably projected onto the world as a rejection of authority, as that unconscious blame of God. And these are
mhm,
the forces trying to integrate through the North Node in Libra and the 12th. This is why this is such an interesting example, of course, because the North Node is right on the 12th house cusp, so that Pisces level of the symbolism is some kind of balance or understanding of the other that this person is trying to learn,
Mm-hmm.
mhm,
that he
Absolutely.
hasn't had before, in this kind of driven by this inner tyranny or experiences of outward tyranny in hierarchical systems that he has experienced as betraying or impinging his freedom, but he hasn't really understood truly the role of the other, has he? And that's the evolutionary intention, is to explore more profoundly the meaning of the other, and therefore the fairness, the issue of equality.
mhm.
The Pluto polarities in the seventh, the North Node in Libra, and the Venus is in new phase to the Pluto, so it's a very new cycle, isn't it? This is a kind
Mm-hmm.
of
Mhm.
turning
Yes,
point.
yeah, we recognize that. And
Mm-hmm.
that ability to find his own self-reliance with the other, because he does these extremes of either dominating in relationship or allowing himself to be pimped, as we have been putting in his face lately.
You tell it straight, guys. Don't hold back.
Well, I've got an observation from Roland in New Zealand here that I think is real valid. It's not about judging any generational archetype, of course, but they question. Roland says they challenge and question the concept of responsibility and authority because it's become so distorted today in our society as we know it. There could
Yeah.
be, and probably is, an extreme reaction at first, but a necessary one. So, how difficult must it be to enter society seeing it all for what it really is, Scorpio. And
Mhm.
I do know that this kid, he's what I learned about this Pluto and Scorpio generation is you just have to be brutally honest at all times. They'll sense the manipulation. They'll sense when you're not. It's been difficult for me to be that because I want to be my son's friend, but I've learned at this point, as he's extricating himself from to start his own life, and becoming responsible for himself, that I just need to do a better job of being direct and honest.
Look at the Mercury conjunct the North Node ruling the 10th house.
Mhm.
I mean, it's like
Mhm.
you, Leroy, as his dad, you are some kind of figure. You're some fruition of some recent understanding that he's come to, that at least he listened somewhat to others, at least he took something in about that Mercury in Libra on the North Node, and the Mercury function has begun to accept the reality of the other on some level, coming in through the 10th house ruler, like probably something, what you represent for him is a healing opportunity. And then the Neptune, which by the way is on the south node of Saturn. I mean, I do think with this Neptune Uranus in Capricorn trauma signature, you are looking at issues to do with the whole history of civilization, and in some ways, therefore, in the kind of peaking of our civilization and its somewhat inevitable decline, essentially, the decline of the West, as it were, Spengler or whatever that old famous book was. This generation's sold out on some level, aren't they? I mean, the economy is never as good. The college prices, the property prices, loads of kids don't leave home till their 30s because they've got nowhere to go. They can never get a job that would lead to the kind of lifestyle that their parents would have had. That whole post-war boom, that whole Pluto in Leo, even early stages of Pluto in Virgo, kind of, the days when banks didn't just disappear through gambling all their money away. And there's something that they're carrying, a karma around that, isn't there, about the destruction of the trust in hierarchy and the trust in civilization itself, which has failed many people. But it obviously reaches an extreme projection here, and you can look at the projective power, can't you? The North Node in Libra, in the 12th, the way this person could project just vast fantasies really onto others or the world at large, based on his own feeling, Venus in Sag, about himself on a deep level, conjunct Pluto. Yeah, interesting, intriguing, quite powerful chart.
Yeah, he's a powerhouse.
He's a powerhouse, and he's pretty darn good psychologically. He's extremely intelligent, but there's a lot of laziness, and he just doesn't. I mean, his mom and his dad and I, the three of us, were very good friends. I was her astrological client forever. We very metaphysically, reincarnationally based. This guy grew up with spirituality, metaphysics all the time, and we cannot get him to engage in a discussion about it. There's the wound there, there's the anger there, and basically what we're doing is just patiently waiting until life brings the experiences that his why is ready to listen.
I bet you there's a past life as a religious warrior, and in the death process there was an intense disillusionment about the religious reasons or the fundamentalism that underlay the conflict. I bet you. And that's part of still the attachment to the rejection of meaning, still too associated with that experience.
Well, and what we've had to be very, very careful with is him feeling that God took mom away.
Yeah.
So it's been a delicate subject to work around.
Yeah, that void that you just described, Mark, and it kind of plays out in this lifetime through the online gaming atmosphere.
Yes.
And in that reality where League of Legends, I don't know what all the brand names are, but he gets very absorbed in that genre that you described could be a source of the past life trauma.
I really think in lots of these games, kids are just playing out, and grown adults are playing out unconscious memories of war, conflict, and depending on the kinds of games they're into,
Yeah.
That whole first-person shooter type game, which obviously has echoes in the great wars of the 20th century all the way back. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I wanted to put this up for everybody before we close, so you can get a chance to copy this down. And Mark, you did an absolutely beautiful, beautiful weaving of the story of the 2nd, 7th, 12th. Thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure. I really enjoyed sort of online webinar hanging out with you guys, actually.
I know, this has been fun.
It has been fun.
I hope everybody else has listened, and I'm sorry we have you muted. If we unmuted you all, none of us would be able to hear. So thank you all very much as we wind down these last few minutes. And could you get this in a PDF? Sure, I can do that. I can definitely do that for you. Any final questions from anybody? Any final questions or comments on this subject matter? You can type into the attendee thing. Raise your hand. Are you running a poll?
I'm running our last poll of the day as you take final questions, Kim. So we'll ask everybody to give their response as they see it. It's a little self-serving, of course, promoting our segment 2 materials here that we're going to offer in the fall. And Kim, of course, is going to start segment 2 classes via the webinar format in January. So just know that we're gifting out a coupon code there that you can take advantage if you're interested in joining us via segment 2 this fall and winter with Evolutionary Astrology Network. So about a third of the people have voted. Everybody looks like they've gotten that self-serving right answer. So I just wanted to, again, that's a $50 value for a coupon code on segment 2 materials. And I'll go ahead and close the poll and we'll share some results. Thank you very much, Mark, for everything you've done over the years. You know, I'm not sure. I think the first time we met personally was actually in Sedona in 05, was it not?
Yes. What a
Mark,
go on.
yeah, Mark, you and I met in Port Townsend at the first Evolutionary
No,
Astrology
it
Conference.
was Dakota. We met. No,
What?
in it was Vancouver. We met in Vancouver.
Oh,
Not
sure.
Port Townsend.
Okay.
It was Vancouver.
Oh, Vancouver. You weren't part of Port Townsend?
No, because I was still just a
Okay.
student essentially, and then there was Sedona, which was kind of an amazing place and its own thing, and then there was the Dakota experience, which truly was crazy for me because I flew to Seattle first and straight back to Dakota, which did something so strange to jet lag. I've never had that experience in my life before. But the energy in those hills and the landscape there, and we're all in these crazy huts with the deer outside, and you know, people aren't sleeping, and that process that was being described at the conference earlier by Judy, you know, that kind of breaking down to rebuild, I think was happening to all of us in Dakota. For sure it was happening to me. um,
Absolutely.
so,
As we all sat on top of basically a geoload of crystal formation at the highest point in the Black Hills of South Dakota.
something was going on, man. I was like going to bed really tired, waking up 3 hours later, like totally awake with like electricity running through me, and it was 3 a.m. You know.
Well,
Yeah.
the joke is our little Black Hills is one of the most geologically diverse places in the world, and we literally do live on a quartz crystal, and it includes everything else. I mean, we got the igneous core. We were really on the igneous core with the quartz crystal coming up through it.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes those who are extremely sensitive can get a little whacked by it.
Well, you're tapping into a lot of Black Elk energy as well, because that's where the Lakota tribes still gather every solstice, spring solstice, and do their ceremony, establishing new um, bears.
Calling in the thunder beings.
They call in the thunder beings and hike to the top of Harney Peak. Of course, we renamed it Harney Peak. They called it Thunder Being Mountain, and a lot of Lakota energy, of course, in that place and throughout the Black Hills.
It was a remarkable place, absolutely remarkable. I love the webinar thing because I don't have to get a 9.5 hour flight, and that's assuming it's direct, which sometimes it's frankly not, in which case sometimes the journey can be like 20 hours or something. But you know, every now and then we must actually meet in person too, whether it's the Black Hills or somewhere, just for that, you know, crazy after the talks, couple of margaritas, catch up momentum, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Mark, because we're looking forward to inviting you back on as soon as we figure out the next best event. We would just love to have you, and of course, participate with you um, on this in this way. And we sure appreciate the input and everything that you've
Yeah.
given to
I've
EA over the
genuinely
Yes.
years.
enjoyed it. I've enjoyed both things, and particularly some dialogue today, and just in hearing about you guys and your, you know, transformational process really in a really clear kind of way. Like personally interesting and astrologically really useful at the same time. Like really clear illustration, but it was just great to catch up and hang out with you guys.
Ditto. Most ditto, and everybody else who's been on this call. Stay tuned as we move into the fall, because we'll have more things planned on a public level with this webinar medium. It's a great medium for us to operate through. And we'll still do live events. Leroy and I actually found a new place to host everybody in the Black Hills. We've also been invited by Kari to the new Skyhawk Ranch in Oregon, and so live events in the future, yes, we will, but in between then, we can really make use of this new webinar format.
It's an incredible format, isn't it? Because the PowerPoint can be so clear and people can just see it so clearly. It's not like on some big projector at the end of a room where some people who aren't sat at the right angle to it can't see it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so clear. Just looking at your diagram now, it's such a good diagram. And then one can talk around that and people can visually take in so clearly at the same time. And one can even take Q&A. I mean, it's remarkable, really.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. And thank you, everybody out there. We'll let that be the last word. And thank you for participating. Astrology, Reincarnation, and Soul 2013. And thank you again, Mark.
Yeah, thank you guys. All the best.
And Kim Murray, of course.
All right. Ditto back to everybody, and this is my adios to everyone, and I appreciate all of you very much.